In an evening of silence that seems to be stretched between the two breaths of the universe, I invite you to embark on another journey, one in which together we discover the deepest layers of the soul and the silence hidden behind the relentless movements of everyday life. Tonight, as you sit here listening from where you are, you will receive the deep insights drawn from the treasure trove of ancient knowledge, teachings that have passed through thousands of years and still retain the power to lead the restless mind back to the unparalleled peace and pristine stillness that belongs to you. Take a gentle breath and let your body relax in the most natural way. For now, when you open your heart, ancient wisdom is right here, patiently waiting for your presence. I will lead you through a collection of Buddhist stories and quintessential Zen insights, not in the form of dry teachings, but as cool streams that gently peel away the dust of the mind, revealing the subtle art of mental freedom and emotional liberation. Each story contains a teaching that has the potential to profoundly change the way you feel about stress, afflictions, repetitive thoughts that never stop, or the tireless search for something outside to fill the void within. These aren't just stories to pass through your ears. They are guides carefully guarded for generations by masters who have seen and touched a truth that most of humanity has lost in the midst of the hustle and bustle of life. It is the truth that true tranquility can never be found by trying to arrange the world around us perfectly, but by rearranging the inner landscape where all experiences originate. As the great Zen master Dogen said, to study the path is to study oneself. To study oneself is to forget oneself. And to forget oneself is to be illuminated by all things. As we listen tonight, you can feel a very slight but very real change taking place. The squeeze of anxiety that you may have carried around throughout the day will slowly loosen. The noise of thoughts that are crowding in your mind will begin to recede like a receding tide. And you'll find yourself settling into a state of understanding and tranquility that you've probably forgotten you used to know. Let yourself sink deeper into this feeling. Let the body lean against whatever is supporting it. Let your breath go in and out without being in a hurry. For now, I'm going to bring you to an ancient story, a story about the subtle but decisive difference between resistance and acceptance, between struggling with the laws of life and becoming one with them. In the misty mountains, where the pines that rise as if to touch the sky have existed for thousands of years, there is an ancient monastery where Zen master Baizhang Huaihai taught his disciples the secrets of awakening. Every night, when it was dark, the monks gathered to listen to the Dharma, and between them often appeared an elderly man whom no one knew where he had come from or where he had gone. He came and went quietly, unnoticed, until one evening when the Dharma was over and everyone was out to enjoy the cool mountain breeze. The old man remained, standing still in the darkness as if waiting for something. Baizhang walked over, took a closer look at him, and realized in his silence that there was something that did not belong in the human world. "Who are you standing here in front of me?" he asked, his voice full of compassion and curiosity. The old man's eyes contained a timeless sadness. He replied in a trembling voice that echoed from a distant era, "You are not human, though you look like a human. Since the time of Kashyapa Buddha, I have been the abbot of this monastery." And then a false answer in pride made me live 500 lives in the form of a wild fox. He said that in the past, a disciple asked him, Does an enlightened person fall into the law of cause and effect? And in stupid confidence, he replied, no, an enlightened person no longer suffers from cause and effect. It was this answer that cost him 5 centuries of drifting as an animal, unable to return to being a human, even though he remembered every prayer and every breath of his cultivation. Now, when the last opportunity came before him, he knelt before Baizhang, begging for the right instruction to free him from that endless karma. He repeated the fateful question, does an enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect? Baizhang looked into the old man's eyes and saw in them 2 overlapping lives, the ancient wise abbot and the fox weary waiting for liberation. With the calm voice of someone who has understood the truth for a long time, he replied, an enlightened person is one with the law of cause and effect. Just 1 sentence, but its force seemed to pierce the mist of 5 centuries. The old man burst into tears, tears rolling down as if melting his whole life. I'm free. He bowed his head deeply and said his real body was in a cave on the other side of the mountain. The next morning, Baizhang led his disciples on their way. They walked through winding slopes, over steep rocks, until he pointed to a crevice in a rock with his stick. Inside was the corpse of a large fox. But for Baizhang, it was the body of a monk who had just been freed. He performed the funeral according to the noble rites reserved for monks, so that his soul could finally return. The Buddha taught, what we think, we become. What we feel, we attract. What we imagine, we create. Enlightenment does not lie in being free from the law of cause and effect, but in seeing that we have never been separated from it. The monk's mistake was not an intellectual error. It is a manifestation of an illusion that most of us have, the illusion that we can stand outside the rules of life, that we are separate from the flow of everything. And it is this illusion of separation that is the real prison. We see this in our own lives. When we fight aging, we suffer more than aging itself brings. When we resist failure, we double the pain. When we run away from unpleasant emotions, we make them stronger. Every time we say in our hearts, this shouldn't happen to me, we shoot a second arrow at ourselves, the arrow of resistance. An enlightened person does not stand outside of cause and effect. They are in tune with it. They are not against life. They walk with it, letting life pass through them as naturally as a stream passes through a deep forest. As Suzuki Roshi once said, you're as perfect as you are, and you can still be better. The two may sound contradictory, but they harmonize when we are no longer fighting reality. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh also once said, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. It is impermanence. It is the change of cause and effect that gives us freedom, opportunity, transformation. Freedom does not come from escaping the rule, but from seeing it clearly and accepting it. When we understand that every action, every word, every thought sows a seed, then every moment of life becomes an opportunity to plant the seeds of wisdom and compassion. Responsibility is no longer a burden, but a power. As Baizhang handed over to the monk, all sentient beings can return if they realize the unity between themselves and cause and effect. The story ends not with a miracle, but with a truth. Liberation is never about leaving life, but about coming back to it completely. And now, as you sit and listen to the end of this story, you're probably also feeling something change in you, a softening, a release from the things you've resisted for so long. Tonight, maybe just by listening, you've also planted a new seed, a seed of return, a seed of freedom. Tonight, as you reflect on yourself and notice the places in your life where you are often resisting what is happening, you can experiment with something very light, but very deeply. Instead of thinking that you are submitting or surrendering, try to see yourself as becoming one with what is happening. When you become part of that great current, freedom no longer comes from resistance, but from the full acceptance of your participation in the infinite unfolding of life. The Buddha once taught that hatred cannot be ended by hatred, but only by love. It is the eternal law, not a constraint as many people mistakenly believe, but the very structure from which liberation is woven. In that spirit, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism to a different story, a story of the ability to see beauty in the loss itself, a subtle lesson in impermanence and transformation. The mountain temple where Yunmen Wenyan lived was in autumn at the time, and autumn always brought with it the flavor of poetry, of change and rebirth. The ancient maple groves that once stretched out their hands to shade the meditation rooms during the sweltering heat of summer are now dressed in the last brilliant beauty of the year. Yellow maple leaves, red maple leaves, burnt brown maple leaves, all dancing in the cold mountain wind. The air has a clarity that only autumn brings, as if the sky has just been wiped clean after the rain. In that scene, a young monk walks in the temple courtyard with a heavy heart. The beauty touched him, but at the same time, it aroused a sense of unease. I don't understand why the falling leaves remind me of loss, death, fragility. Perhaps deep in his heart was a sense of ephemerality that people often try to forget. As he passed by the front yard, the young monk saw his teacher, Zen master Yunmen, sweeping leaves. His movements were as light as the wind, and every time he swept without making a sound, it was as if the broom and the ground had known each other for a long time. He walked over with the burden of questions in his heart. "Master," he said, his voice carrying the weight of contemplation, "when the trees wither and the leaves fall, what is really happening? I saw this scene and only felt sad. Why does the beauty of autumn make me think of the end?" Zen master Yunmen stopped, raised his head and looked at the trees. The afternoon sunlight penetrates the last leaves that still cling to the branches, creating shimmering streaks of light like stained glass windows in old cathedrals. In the distance, each leaf falls, spinning as if performing the last dance of one's life. Each leaf has a different falling path, a unique trajectory, like short stories that no one knows. Instead of giving a lengthy explanation of impermanence or the Anicca lesson in Buddhism, he spoke a very short but powerful sentence that opened a whole door to awareness. The golden wind is revealing. The young monk stood still, letting the sentence seep into him. He felt something very slight change in his perception. Sadness is no longer completely sad. Where he saw only the end, his teacher saw only a new beginning. Where he sees death, he sees life manifesting itself in a different form. The autumn wind does not destroy the leaves. It only reveals the natural course of the season. The leaves do not fall off by force. The leaves fall because it's time. And the moment he understood that, his steps also became lighter. The Buddha's wisdom reminds us that the past has passed, the future has not yet come, and that life is only really present in this moment. The human mind, however, is in the habit of assigning every change a shade of loss, as if we were the custodians of what life never intended to keep. Why do we hurt when we see the leaves falling? Why can't we see the golden wind, but only the decay? Zen Buddhism believes that it is the habit of looking at the world through the lens of one's own fears. The fear of loss, the fear of old age, the fear of separation, the fear of impermanence project onto every change a sense of threat. When the leaves fall, we think of death. When work changes, we think about failure. When a relationship breaks down, we think of abandonment. But in all of this, the golden wind is still present, a force of life that is transforming its form, not disappearing. It is strange that we are always looking for eternity in a world that is inherently impermanent. We want things to stay as we want them to, not changing, not drifting away. And it is that desire that blinds us to the beauty of movement. But what if autumn is not an end, but the peak of the cycle? What if the falling leaves are not a sign of death, but the last gift the tree sends back to the soil? When the leaves rot, they become a nourishing substance so that the next spring will sprout again. The golden wind reveals this beauty, the beauty of vast rotation, where nothing is lost but only transformed. When we look deeply into our own experience, we see the same thing. A job that ends seems like a failure, but opens up new possibilities. A broken relationship breaks up that hurts the heart, but then we discover a part of ourselves that we have never had the chance to meet. Even aging, which society teaches us to resist, is actually like the golden wind. It brings wisdom, deposition, another beauty that youth does not have. Zen master Dogen says that studying the Buddha's path is studying oneself, and studying oneself is forgetting oneself. When we forget our frightened little self, we realize that we are part of the golden wind that passes through everything. I am not a person who stands by and watches life fade. I am the one who is dancing in that very dance. Realizing this makes sadness turn into deep gratitude. The leaves do not fall off painfully. The leaves fall off when they have fulfilled their role, and each falling leaf is a small festival of complete fulfillment. When we are in tune with this natural rhythm, our own changes become gentler. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh said, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." The golden wind brings the fallen leaves of autumn, but also the flower buds of spring. The same power that causes our bodies to age also makes our minds ripen, to become more compassionate and alert. Tonight, as you look back on your life and the changes that are taking place in the world or within yourself, you can try to ask, in what seems to be the end, can I see the golden wind? It may be that it is in the old things that are falling apart that a new possibility is being revealed. The Buddha taught, all things that are conditioned are impermanent. Be diligent in practicing your own liberation. The golden wind is not something to hold on to or to resist. It is the means by which we learn to awaken, to see that change itself is the path that leads us to freedom. In the mornings in the monastery where Mazu Daoyi lives and teaches, there is always a special silence, as if every beat of the wind and every distant bell is listening to himself. His wisdom, unique and elusive, flows through ancient corridors like mountain streams. Sudden, direct, and impossible to contain in conventional conceptual frameworks. That morning, when the dew was still gently clinging to the temple eaves and the smell of damp pine wood permeated the air, a young monk with a solemn appearance quietly approached Mazu. In his heart was burning with a question that had blurred the peace that meditation should have brought. He had spent years reading scriptures, memorizing ancient texts, poring over mountains of commentaries and commentaries. But strangely enough, all these efforts had not brought him closer to the truth he sought. There was a time when he felt that the more he learned, the wider the distance between himself and the truth became, as if the words were nothing more than clouds obscuring the sky he wanted to see. Bowing deeply to the teacher, with sincere respect and longing, he asked, "Master Bai, what is the true nature of the Buddha's teachings? I have looked in the scriptures, in the teachings of the commentators, but it seems that the more I read, the more I am obscured instead of enlightened. Please show me the heart of the Dharma, which lies beneath all these layers of meaning." Mazu didn't reply right away. His eyes were fixed on the monk, a strange look as if he saw not only the questioner, but also the question and its origin, an inseparable union. Without preparation, without a hesitant breath, without a piece of explanation on the mold, Mazu opened his mouth and let out a scream so resonant that it seemed to pierce both space and time, bouncing from the very depths of existence. "Ha!" Screams exploded throughout the monastery like thunder in the middle of the sky. The old wooden pillars shook slightly. The birds in the nearby canopy were startled and scattered. And in the farther corridors, the monks who were walking on the pilgrimage stopped involuntarily, their hearts pounding at the sudden burst of energy. And the young monk, who had prepared a whole list of questions, stood as silent as a stone statue. All the thoughts that he had cherished, arranged, and considered suddenly disintegrated like leaves caught up in a storm. In that moment, the silence fell like a brand new cloth, pure and without the dust of thought. He did not understand with his mind what had just happened, but he felt intensely that all that he had once believed was necessary to understand the Tao seemed to be shaking. That afternoon, another monk in the monastery, hearing rumors of the morning events, approached the young monk with a curious look. "I heard him teach you this morning. What are you saying?" The young monk, still feeling a tremor from deep inside, replied in a small but clear voice, "You shouted at me." That answer made the other disciple even more excited and confused. He immediately went to look for Mazu, his heart full of questions. When he met the teacher, he bowed and asked, "Master Bai, I heard that when a monk asked you about the nature of the Buddha's teachings, you shouted at him. Is that true?" "Yes," Mazu said simply, without adding a hint of color. The disciple continued, "But why? What is the real meaning of screaming? What do you want to convey?" Without waiting any longer, Mazu shouted again. This time, the sound seemed to pierce the questioner's heart, and in that lightning strike, the second monk felt a strange shattering. His mind was no longer trapped in the question, no longer caught up in the web of reasoning. A vast space opens up, in which there are no questions, no answers, only wordless clarity. At that moment, he realized. The profound teaching of that morning was not in any sequence of explanations, because the true nature of wisdom cannot be locked up in words. Meditation teaches that truth is not a concept to be grasped, but a reality that needs to be experienced directly. We tend to look for an explanation for the mystery instead of letting it seep into us. Our conceptual mind, useful in everyday life, becomes a barrier when we want to touch the essence of being. It's like trying to catch the wind with a jar. That effort is inherently wrong from the root. Mazu's scream is a sharp blade that cuts through the bushes that our minds have created for itself. Layers of thoughts, reasoning, trying to interpret, all of which prevent us from seeing what is right in front of us. When the mind asks, "What does this mean?" it is this question that builds a wall between us and the truth. The shouting isn't to answer the question, It's to shatter the person asking. In everyday life, we are also surrounded by confusion between description and experience. We read about love instead of love, study maps instead of travel, analyze meditation techniques instead of sitting still in the present moment. Modern education leads us to believe that knowledge means accumulating information, but Zen suggests a different kind of understanding, only when we step beneath the mind's conceptual processing layer. It is not anti-intellectual, but understanding that wisdom is not always found in structured thinking. A Korean Zen master once said, "Only the mind does not know." But this ignorance is not ignorance, but an infinite opening, ready to receive the truth directly without intermediaries. When Mazu screams, the sound is no longer a sound. It is a teaching that transcends meaning, a direct transmission from the teacher's mind to the student's mind, not through books. That is the essence of Zen, to point directly to the mind, to see the Buddha nature. Think about your own experience. You can read hundreds of descriptions of the taste of chocolate, but it's only when you taste it for the first time that you really understand what it is. In the same way, the essence of the Buddha's teachings is not in the scriptures, but in the moment we see our own true nature directly, without inference. The sage Krishnamurti once said, "The truth is a land without paths." Such a land cannot be reached by the trail of old knowledge, not by maps or instructions, but by the willingness to enter the unknown with an empty heart. The story of Mazu's scream, which is strange to the novice, is a testament to how Zen leads the seeker to freedom from the shackles of thought. When the conceptual layer collapses, what is left is the already existing clarity. When the questioner disappears, the answer reveals itself. When the mind is no longer trying to grasp it, truth blooms on its own like a flower of the morning. And so, the morning in that monastery was not just a story between a teacher and two disciples. It is the moment where the shouting becomes the door, the silence becomes the Dharma, and that the listener, whether unexpectedly or intentionally, is invited to enter the wordless land of direct understanding. It is also a reminder to each of us that there are truths that can only be realized when we dare to let go of all efforts to understand, to grasp, and to name, and when we are courageous enough to face what is right here, without judgment, without interpretation, without evasion. In that openness, what we have been seeking for so long finally has a chance to reveal itself. Tonight, when the night falls as lightly as the last breath of the day, and vague thoughts about the meaning of life arise again in you, perhaps you can try to approach them in the same way that Mazu does. Without analysis, without searching, without trying to understand, but only suddenly shouting a decisive "Ha!" to feel the vibrancy present just before the mind has time to name or interpret. The Buddha once taught, "Be a lamp to yourself." A lamp does not shine by reading an interpretation of light, but by emitting light itself. Sometimes the most profound teachings are not in a long sermon, but in a scream that breaks all old assumptions, so that what is so obvious, that which has always been present, is finally revealed. Once we have understood this spirit, we can move on to another story, one about the difference between the accumulation of knowledge and the expression of wisdom. When Foyan was teaching in the ancient mountains of China, many scholars traveled long distances to pray for the Dharma, carrying countless scrolls, commentaries, and personal notebooks. They came like merchants carrying chariots laden with precious goods, each eager to add to the treasure trove of divine knowledge that they believed was the key to enlightenment. Among them was a young student whose face was both bright and full of disappointment. The cloth bag next to him was swollen with scrolls of notebooks, and his notebook contained countless meticulous handwritten lines, sentence by sentence of the sages from ancient times. His cloak was worn from the distance, and his eyes carried the wariness of a seeker who seemed to retreat further and further out of reach. After years of intensive research, the student felt like a person dying of thirst, but only carried in his hands detailed descriptions of water. He bowed deeply to Foyan and expressed his confusion in a heavy voice. "Master, I have spent many years studying sutras, exegesis, and treatises. I memorized the Vajrayana Sutra, the Flower Sutra, and the Heart Sutra. I can teach about the Eightfold Path, distinguishing each school of Buddhist thought with an accuracy that is difficult for ordinary people to achieve. But even though I have read, studied, and memorized so much, I don't feel any closer to enlightenment. My mind is always full of concepts, and wisdom eludes me like a mist that dissolves into the early sun." Foyan listens with the calmness of someone who has heard this suffering so many times that it is so familiar. He observed the student's posture. His shoulders were slightly bent, as if he was carrying a heavy, invisible library. His eyes constantly glanced left and right, as if referencing every moment with what he had memorized in the book. When the student finished speaking, Foyan smiled gently, not reproachful, but full of sympathy. "You are like a man in possession of the most detailed map of a great treasure," he said softly. "I can describe every landmark, every river to cross, every rugged mountain range, every rock cave where treasure can be hidden. You can show others the way with your eyes closed. You know the terrain better than the person who drew that map. But there is this: your slippers don't have any dust." The student was startled and looked down at his feet. His sandals were unusually clean, bearing no trace of real miles. From there, he began to understand what he meant. The knowledge he accumulated was a lot, but it was all the knowledge of the person who looked at the map, but never set foot on the road. Foyan continued, his voice still calm but ringing like a bell through the student's mind. "I have a lot, but it's all just theory. I'm like someone who studies swimming techniques and has never been in the water, or someone who knows all the cooking skills but has never touched fire." The meaning of the teacher's words was gradually brightening, but the habit of reasoning pulled the student back. "Then, master, should I give up the whole scripture? Have you been wasting your time for so many years?" Foyan shook his head. "No, not to abandon the classics, but I have to let the classics leave me." The student was surprised. "Let the classics leave me. What is it?" Foyan explains. "When your child walks, just walk. Don't take with you the idea of what the Buddha described as meditation. When your child eats, eat only. Don't compare your meal with the verses that talk about true thoughts. When your child reads the sutras, don't try to grab the teachings to add to their collection of knowledge. Let the prayers flow through you like a stream passing through a rock. You don't need to hold back the water to understand it. Let it flow." The student frowned, embarrassed. "But if you don't try to understand the teachings, how can you learn from them? Isn't deep analysis necessary?" Foyan's eyes shone with compassionate insight. "The truth is not in the meaning. The truth lies in the openness of your mind when you come into contact with that meaning. The classics are like the moon reflecting on the water. You can look at the reflection and see the way, but if you try to scoop up the moon with a bucket, you'll only stir up meaningless ripples. Foyen pointed to the monastery's garden, where a monk was sweeping the leaves. "Look," he said. "He didn't learn to clean by learning theory. He learns by holding a broom every day so that the movement becomes natural. Now the broom swept over him, not that he was trying to sweep. The same goes for the intellect. It's not the information in the head, it's the understanding that flows through the whole person." The student watched and noticed something very strange. The monk was not self-conscious of his actions. There is no technique, no thought, only pure and complete movement. It seems that he is no longer scanning, but has become that scan. From that day on, the student began to approach the doctrine in a different way. Instead of reading the sutras like a gatherer of knowledge, he reads like a listener to the wind weaving through the pines, gently, not trying to take it, not trying to possess. When he encounters a passage about compassion, he looks for an opportunity to be kind instead of memorizing the definition. When he reads about mindfulness, he sits still and listens to the breath instead of analyzing the levels of mindfulness as before. When the teaching spoke of impermanence, he watched the golden leaf fall in the yard, instead of turning to the commentaries for further interpretation. And strangely enough, when he stopped trying to grasp wisdom, wisdom began to seep into him like water seeps into dry soil. His mind gradually became quieter, his gestures softer, his words simpler but deeper, not because he was trying to follow the rules, but because the teachings had become part of himself. He no longer studied the Buddha's words with his head, but lived the Buddha's spirit with every breath. The Buddha once said, "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of that candle does not diminish." It is the same with wisdom. It is not a possession, but a light that is spread through life experience, through practice, through letting go of knowledge, so that a more vivid intellect can be revealed. On the day the student realized that he had taken the first real steps on the path, he suddenly understood that what had stopped him for so long was not a lack of knowledge, but too much knowledge. Not wrong knowledge, but clinging to knowledge. It was not that the scriptures were difficult, but that his mind always tried to possess the scriptures instead of letting them illuminate. And at that moment, he remembered Mazu's scream, a scream that broke all concepts. In the same way, Foyen's teachings add nothing to him, but take away from him. Take away what is hidden. Perhaps tonight, as you sit across from yourself, you can also let go of all the things you think you know about life, about yourself, about meaning and value. You can try shouting "ha" out loud, and then let things blow up without having to understand. Who knows, in that moment, you'll catch a glimpse of the vibrancy that's been here for a long time, obscured only by over-the-top efforts to find something that's not hidden. Tonight, when the night falls as lightly as the last breath of the day, and vague thoughts about the meaning of life arise again in you, perhaps you can try to approach them in the same way that Mazu does, without analysis, without searching, without trying to understand, but only suddenly shouting a decisive "ha" to feel the vibrancy present just before the mind has time to name or interpret. The Buddha once taught, "Be a lamp to yourself." A lamp does not shine by reading an interpretation of light, but by emitting light itself. Sometimes the most profound teachings are not in a long sermon, but in a scream that breaks all old assumptions, so that what is so obvious, that which has always been present, is finally revealed. Once we have understood this spirit, we can move on to another story, one about the difference between the accumulation of knowledge and the expression of wisdom. When Foyan was teaching in the ancient mountains of China, many scholars traveled long distances to pray for the Dharma, carrying countless scrolls, commentaries, and personal notebooks. They came like merchants carrying chariots laden with precious goods, each eager to add to the treasure trove of divine knowledge that they believed was the key to enlightenment. Among them was a young student whose face was both bright and full of disappointment. The cloth bag next to him was swollen with scrolls of notebooks, and his notebook contained countless meticulous handwritten lines, sentence by sentence of the sages from ancient times. His cloak was worn from the distance, and his eyes carried the wariness of a seeker who seemed to retreat further and further out of reach. After years of intensive research, the student felt like a person dying of thirst, but only carried in his hands detailed descriptions of water. He bowed deeply to Foyan and expressed his confusion in a heavy voice. "Master, I have spent many years studying sutras, exegesis, and treatises. I memorized the Vajrayana Sutra, the Flower Sutra, and the Heart Sutra. I can teach about the Eightfold Path, distinguishing each school of Buddhist thought with an accuracy that is difficult for ordinary people to achieve. But even though I have read, studied, and memorized so much, I don't feel any closer to enlightenment. My mind is always full of concepts, and wisdom eludes me like a mist that dissolves into the early sun." Foyan listens with the calmness of someone who has heard this suffering so many times that it is so familiar. He observed the student's posture. His shoulders were slightly bent, as if he was carrying a heavy, invisible library. His eyes constantly glanced left and right, as if referencing every moment with what he had memorized in the book. When the student finished speaking, Foyan smiled gently, not reproachful, but full of sympathy. "You are like a man in possession of the most detailed map of a great treasure," he said softly. "I can describe every landmark, every river to cross, every rugged mountain range, every rock cave where treasure can be hidden. You can show others the way with your eyes closed. You know the terrain better than the person who drew that map. But there is this: your slippers don't have any dust." The student was startled and looked down at his feet. His sandals were unusually clean, bearing no trace of real miles. From there, he began to understand what he meant. The knowledge he accumulated was a lot, but it was all the knowledge of the person who looked at the map, but never set foot on the road. Foyan continued, his voice still calm but ringing like a bell through the student's mind. "I have a lot, but it's all just theory. I'm like someone who studies swimming techniques and has never been in the water, or someone who knows all the cooking skills but has never touched fire." The meaning of the teacher's words was gradually brightening, but the habit of reasoning pulled the student back. "Then, Master, should I give up the whole scripture? Have you been wasting your time for so many years?" Foyan shook his head. "No, not to abandon the classics, but I have to let the classics leave me." The student was surprised. "Let the classics leave me? What is it?" Foyan explains. "When your child walks, just walk. Don't take with you the idea of what the Buddha described as meditation. When your child eats, eat only. Don't compare your meal with the verses that talk about true thoughts. When your child reads the sutras, don't try to grab the teachings to add to their collection of knowledge. Let the prayers flow through you like a stream passing through a rock. You don't need to hold back the water to understand it. Let it flow. The student frowned, embarrassed. But if you don't try to understand the teachings, how can you learn from them? Isn't deep analysis necessary? Foyen's eyes shone with compassionate insight. The truth is not in the meaning. The truth lies in the openness of your mind when you come into contact with that meaning. The classics are like the moon reflecting on the water. You can look at the reflection and see the way. But if you try to scoop up the moon with a bucket, you'll only stir up meaningless ripples. Foyen pointed to the monastery's garden, where a monk was sweeping the leaves. "Look," he said. "He didn't learn to clean by learning theory. He learns by holding a broom every day, so that the movement becomes natural. Now the broom swept over him, not that he was trying to sweep. The same goes for the intellect. It's not the information in the head, it's the understanding that flows through the whole person." The student watched and noticed something very strange. The monk was not self-conscious of his actions. There is no technique, no thought, only pure and complete movement. It seems that he is no longer scanning, but has become that scan. From that day on, the student began to approach the doctrine in a different way. Instead of reading the sutras like a gatherer of knowledge, he reads like a listener to the wind weaving through the pines. Gently, not trying to take it, not trying to possess. When he encounters a passage about compassion, he looks for an opportunity to be kind instead of memorizing the definition. When he reads about mindfulness, he sits still and listens to the breath instead of analyzing the levels of mindfulness as before. When the teaching spoke of impermanence, he watched the golden leaf fall in the yard instead of turning to the commentaries for further interpretation. And strangely enough, when he stopped trying to grasp wisdom, wisdom began to seep into him like water seeps into dry soil. His mind gradually became quieter, his gestures softer, his words simpler but deeper. Not because he was trying to follow the rules, but because the teachings had become part of himself. He no longer studied the Buddha's words with his head, but lived the Buddha's spirit with every breath. The Buddha once said, "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of that candle does not diminish." It is the same with wisdom. It is not a possession, but a light that is spread through life experience, through practice, through letting go of knowledge, so that a more vivid intellect can be revealed. On the day the student realized that he had taken the first real steps on the path, he suddenly understood that what had stopped him for so long was not a lack of knowledge, but too much knowledge. Not wrong knowledge, but clinging to knowledge. It was not that the scriptures were difficult, but that his mind always tried to possess the scriptures instead of letting them illuminate. And at that moment, he remembered Mazu's scream, a scream that broke all concepts. In the same way, Foyen's teachings add nothing to him, but take away from him. Take away what is hidden. Perhaps tonight, as you sit across from yourself, you can also let go of all the things you think you know about life, about yourself, about meaning and value. You can try shouting "ha" out loud, and then let things blow up without having to understand. Who knows, in that moment, you'll catch a glimpse of the vibrancy that's been here for a long time, obscured only by over-the-top efforts to find something that's not hidden. On a quiet afternoon, when thoughts about the meaning of your life's experiences begin to rise like thin jets of smoke rising from the still smoldering ashes, you can try the Mazu approach, not by analysis, not by reasoning, but with the most pristine vividness. Instead of trying to explain what your life is saying, what the universe is suggesting, or what recent events have philosophical implications, you can simply shout a thunderous "ha" from your chest and feel life rising before any interpretation appears. The Buddha once taught, "Be a lamp unto yourself." A lamp does not explain its light, it merely illuminates, as it is by its very nature. Sometimes the deepest doctrine, it turns out, is not a word or a system of thought, but a wordless scream. Shatter the rigid assumptions we have hung in our minds, opening up the glittering obviousness that we have seen thousands of times but never really seen. And from that beginning, we enter another story. A story about the difference between collecting wisdom and living with wisdom. During Foyen's time teaching among the ancient mountains, where trails weave through rocks and roots like lines of thought deeply embedded in the human mind, many scholars from all over the world flock to carry heavy bags of knowledge. Scriptures, scrolls, comments, commentaries, and countless concepts that they consider as sacred treasures. They came as merchants on the last trade voyage of their lives, with their wagons full of gold, but not knowing what the gold was used for. They spoke of enlightenment in the voices of people who described a city they had never set foot in. They discussed the truth as if they were talking about a rare fragrance that they had never smelled. One of those young students came to Foyen with a tired face. His luggage bag was filled with meticulously handwritten sutras. His notebook is as thick as 100 years of history because of the stacked notes and comments. His shirt was worn out after years of wandering, but his eyes were tired in the manner of someone who had walked too long on a detour without once taking the right shortcut. He knelt down, his forehead almost touching the ground, and said, "Teacher, I have been studying for many years. I memorized the Flower Sutra, the Vajrayana Sutra, and the Heart Sutra. I understand the teachings of the sects well and can distinguish their subtle nuances. I speak of the Eightfold Path as if I were talking about a familiar path. But I see that I am not even a little closer to enlightenment. My heart is a lake full of meaning, but it is as dry as a traveler in the desert." Foyen finished listening, nodding as if he had heard this story 1,000 times in his life. He looked at his student with eyes that knew the invisible weight he was carrying, a massive library on his soft shoulders. Then he said, "You are like the one holding the most detailed map of the treasure. You can point to each place, each mountain, each stream. You can guide others as if you yourself had dug every inch of soil on the journey to the treasure. But," he lowered his voice, as light as a sharp knife, "your slippers are dust-free." The student looked down. It was true that his sandals were strangely clean. They had no trace of dirt roads, no traces of tree roots, no mud from the rugged roads, the paths that a true treasure seeker must traverse. And he understands. His knowledge, though massive, is still just words plastered on a cold wall. He never left. But the mind accustomed to reasoning immediately reacted. "So, sir, do you have to throw away the classics?" he asked. "Do you have to give up all the things you've learned?" "No," Foyen smiled. "You don't need to give up the classics. You just need to let the classics leave you." Then he said, "When you go, just go. Don't take the thought of how the Buddha used to talk about it. When your child eats, just eat. Don't analyze whether you're mindful enough. When you recite the sutras, let the sutras flow through you like a stream flowing through a rock, not holding back, not forcing." The disciple frowned. "But if you don't try to understand, How did you learn? Foyan pointed to the garden with his hand. An old monk was sweeping the leaves, moving gently like the wind. He learned to scan not by memorizing techniques, but by scanning day by day. Then one day, the sweep is no longer he does, but the sweep happens through him. The same is true of wisdom. It is not in the head. It goes through the whole person. From that day, the student changed the way he learned. He didn't read the sutras like someone who wanted to add a few more lines to his notebook. He reads like a person listening to the wind through the pines. Whenever he reads about love, he looks for opportunities to love. Reading about mindfulness, he returned to the breath. Reading about letting go, he opened his hand to what he was holding tightly. And strangely, when he stopped trying to understand, knowledge called itself by name. That story is not only for the ancients. It is the image of us today. We collect spiritual knowledge like people collect stamps. Beautiful, interesting, but nothing changes in real life. We become mobile libraries full of concepts that have never really come to life. Modern culture encourages this. To be smart is to know a lot. To succeed is to possess a lot. And to develop is to accumulate a lot. And we apply that consumption model to our spirituality, trying to cram more teachings, more techniques, more philosophies, as if enlightenment is a final exam with enough passing points. But the strange thing is that the fuller we are, the more empty we become. We can have dozens of self-help books, and our lives are still messy. We can memorize the principles of mindfulness and still be anxious. We can read about compassion and still be cold to the person we love. Because learning is not understanding. Understanding is not living. Living is not becoming. We are only truly transformed when knowledge is no longer a decoration, but becomes a stream of water that creeps into our behavior, words, and eyes. Zen Buddhism calls this disease Zen disease, so immersed in concepts that there is no room for real experience. The ego is so intelligent that it uses spiritual knowledge to shield it from change. It says, I know impermanence to avoid responsibility. He said, I know how to let go to legitimize non-commitment. It says, I know how not to hold on to justify its coldness. Knowledge, instead of opening the door, becomes a lock. Foyan offered the remedy, to return to the unknown mind. The ignorant mind is not ignorant. It is fertile ground that is not overplowed, where the seeds of wisdom can germinate. When we're not in a hurry to label things, teachings can penetrate our defenses and reach the deepest part of ourselves. When we don't try to distort the teachings with the knowledge we already have, they can surprise us, make us vibrate, change us. When we read a teaching, instead of thinking, I know this, we should ask, what part of me does this want to touch today? When we hear someone say something, instead of judging right and wrong, we should ask ourselves, can I open my heart to let this make me different? And then, perhaps, like Foyan's student, we will realize that wisdom comes not from grasping, but from letting ourselves become transparent. It's like a calm water surface reflecting the moon, like the soil catching rain without fighting for every drop, like a broom sweeping through the yard without a plan. Tonight, if you encounter a teaching, in a paragraph, in a sentence, in an everyday moment, can you let it flow through you like a stream? No grasping, no storage, no coercion, reception only. Just feel. Because, as the Buddha said, be diligent in your own liberation. But sometimes that diligence is learning to stand aside so that wisdom can pass through you. That diligence is not about accumulating more, but about removing it. It is not about accumulating knowledge, but about letting the mind become a wide sky. A sky is empty enough for clouds to pass through, deep enough for light to creep in, and it's wide enough that the transformation can happen gently, naturally, like the wind hitting a branch, without you having to make any more effort to control it. In the deep forest covered with morning mist, where the peaks wind like soft strips of gray silk in the opaque sky, there is an ancient monastery that has stood there for generations. Moss-covered stone walls, curved tiled roofs darkened with time, and old wooden lanterns swayed in the night breeze as if whispering stories left by the ancients. In that quiet space, only the sound of the temple bell ringing at dawn breaks through the thick mist, blending with the smell of moist pine wood and the smell of hot tea that the meditators prepare for the chanting at the beginning of the day. In the midst of it, a young monk who had just passed through the early years of his monastic life was immersed in a struggle that no one could see with his eyes, but whose tension was rising in the depths of his consciousness. The koan question that the master gave him, "What is the sound of a clap hand?" became a haunting ghost, a tight rope around the mind that had once been as peaceful as a calm lake. Over the years, that question has been passed down from teacher to student as a door to interiority. But for the young monk, it is like a heavy stone on his chest. Day after day, he knelt in the meditation hall, keeping his posture straight, relaxing his breathing, but his heart swirled in that invisible riddle. He sought it in the sound of the leaves falling outside, in the broom of the monks, in the sound of water droplets falling from the eaves into the stone basin. He tried to visualize the hand, and then tried to discard it. He tried to hear the sound, then tried to forget the sound. But the more things try, the more they become bound. The longer he meditated, the more tense his face became, the more his eyebrows crossed. And the night's sleep became as fragile as a sheet of paper in front of a vibrating fire. His master, an old teacher who had trained through dozens of snow-white winters, watched it all with gentle but sharp eyes. He saw a silent transformation in the pupil's face, from the initial calm innocence to nameless austerity, and finally to the quiet but heavy frustration. Every time the young monk bowed to his teacher before class, a tired look flashed in the bottom of his eyes, as if to admit that he was exhausted but could not give up. One morning, after another night of waking up, the young monk went to the courtyard to wash his face with cold spring water before entering the meditation hall. The water touched his skin like tiny needles, waking him up, but his mind was still heavy with the koan, with no way out. As he had just passed through the temple porch to prepare for the new meditation session, his teacher walked over, lightly placed an old but warm hand on his shoulder, and said in a calm and decisive voice, "My disciple, I am leaving the monastery today. Let's go down to the town under the valley and live there for a week. In the meantime, you must completely forget the question you have been carrying with you for so long. Don't think of a hand. Don't think about how it sounds. Just see, hear, and feel what arises right in front of your eyes, without trying to understand, without trying to achieve anything." Hearing that, the young monk was deeply confused. Until now, it was rare to leave the monastery without solving the koan, but he did not dare to doubt his decision. After kneeling on his teacher's lap 3 times, he gathered up some clothes, a small pitcher of water, and a few rolls of cloth to take notes, and walked down the trail that led to the valley. When he turned his back, The sound of the temple bell rang long and deep, like a gentle and solemn farewell. The mountain road leads down to the town, winding like a silver thread, passing through jagged rocks and lush pine forests. As he stepped down, the young monk heard the sound of the stream gurgling and mingling with the gentle whistling of the wind in the pines. He had never realized that there were so many natural sounds. It seemed that when he didn't have to force himself to figure something out, his ears widened, and the world began to tell its own story in thousands of tiny voices. When he arrived in town, a sea of sounds and colors flooded his senses. The morning market is crowded like a festival. Vegetable sellers call customers with boisterous invitations. Rice sellers lift each bag of white rice high, smiling and greeting. The sound of children playing through narrow alleys. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer knocking on the iron anvil creates a regular rhythm, reverberating far and wide as if to pierce each wall. A beggar sits on the steps, singing ancient folk songs in exchange for a few coins. It all blended into a lively symphony that the young monk had never heard fully when he was in the monastery. He walked through each row, looking for nothing, nor deducing anything. He just listened. Then he looked. Then he felt every step he stepped on the stone floor. For a moment, he stood under the eaves of a tea house to avoid the strong wind, and when the smiling owner invited him in for a cup of hot tea, he suddenly realized he was smiling again, naturally, unintentionally. A lightness crept into every breath. Day after day, he does nothing but walk, observe, listen, feel. He saw two merchants arguing fiercely about the price of agricultural products, but then drinking tea together as if nothing had happened. He saw an old woman walking slowly, but her eyes sparkled as if every step was a simple joy. He felt the afternoon breeze blowing through his collar, the gentle sunlight falling on his shoulders, the smell of food cooked in small kitchens spreading throughout the narrow alleys. All these things when he was in the monastery. He just passed by without actually living with them. On the sixth day, when the bright red sun began to set down the western mountains, the young monk sat on a stone step and watched the flow of people pass by. He thought nothing, nor did he expect to understand anything. He just sat there, listening to the sound of life passing by like a serene river. Suddenly he realized that his mind had stopped searching. There was no tension holding him back anymore. When the week was over, he returned to the monastery. As soon as he saw him from a distance, his teacher noticed the change. The footsteps are lighter, the face relaxed. The eyes were as clear and calm as the surface of the lake in the morning. When the young monk knelt before him, he looked at him for a long time and asked, "During your time in town, did you hear the sound of a hand?" The young monk was silent, but it is full silence, not empty silence. Then he spoke slowly. "Master, the sound of a hand is the joy in the voice of the rice seller when he invites me to try a new grain of rice. It is the perfect silence between the hammer sounds of the blacksmith. It's the warmth of the sun on your cheeks. It's the real fatigue on every step. The sound of a hand is not separated from the world. It is the world that reveals its essence." The old teacher smiled. His smile was as light as a petal falling to the surface of the water, but there was a deep sense of satisfaction hidden inside. He said, "I have stopped looking for something special, and when I stopped looking, I heard it all." Then he turned away, leaving the young monk to stand silently in a silence that spread like the moon falling into the lake. The monastery returned to the familiar rhythms of life. The sound of bells, the sound of leaves, the sound of brooms sweeping the yard. But for the young monk, everything was new. Each sound seemed to contain a whole sky. Each moment was like a portal that opened what he had sought with effort, but could only reach by letting go. From that experience, he understood that spiritual breakthroughs do not come from intense effort, but from living fully with ordinary things. Why do people think that enlightenment must be found in deep mountains, caves, in supernatural mystical states? Zen teaches that it is the search that obscures what is right in front of us. Just like a person who wears glasses but forgets and goes around looking for glasses, people painfully seek the truth, while the truth is the one who is looking for it. The young monk realized that the town wasn't trying to be spiritual, but it was the place where the essence of Zen was most naturally expressed. Crying, laughter, temper, gentleness, they are all the sounds of a hand because they are all the sounds of life itself. Nothing needs to be made sacred. Life itself is completely sacred. He recalled the words of an old Zen master. Fools reject what they see, hold on to what they think. The wise give up what they think, return to what they see. At that time, he understood deeply that koan was not a riddle to be solved, but a door for him to let go of his futile attempt to solve it. That afternoon, while sitting under the eaves of the temple, watching the wind glide through the bamboo rows, the young monk heard the sound of a hand in the wind, the sound of birds, and even the slight beating of his heart. No sound is more important than another. No sound is separate from the other. All blend together, like all streams flowing into a single ocean. He realized that the sound was also present in the most everyday moments of life, in the morning cup of coffee, in the breath of exercise, in the warmth of the sleeping pet curled up next to him, in the awakening of reading simple words on a page. It is not a reward for those who do not attain enlightenment, but the enlightenment that manifests itself through life. That night, before falling asleep, the young monk heard a multitude of sounds outside. The wind, the trees, the insects, and even his heart. It all blends together like a song with no beginning and no end. He smiled, understanding that the listener and the sound heard were just two ripples of the same vast ocean. And as the Buddha once taught, in the end there are only three things that matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, and how well we have let go. The sound of a hand, which he finally heard, was a reminder that living well is listening to the extraordinary that lies within the ordinary. To love well is to cherish what is there instead of longing for what has not yet come. And to let go is to open one's hand from the very search that once bound one's soul. In a small village in the middle of a peaceful valley, where the rice seasons take turns dyeing the horizon golden, and the temple bells ringing every early afternoon, Master Hakuin lives a quiet life that shines like an eternal lamp. For decades, he was respected not only for his erudite wisdom and profound compassion, but also for his calm demeanor like a calm lake in the middle of the morning. For the villagers, he was a clean, enlightened teacher, far beyond the ordinary weaknesses of human beings. They believe that he is the embodiment of a spiritual ideal, a fulcrum for each person to reflect on when encountering fluctuations in life. People come to him for advice, people come to find peace, others simply want to sit near him for a few minutes, because his presence is enough to make people feel relieved, like dropping some invisible burden in their hearts. In the same village, there was a beautiful young girl from a respected family, and her life seemed flat until she became pregnant out of wedlock. The news spread like the wind, creating a shock in the close-knit and well-organized community. Her parents were so angry that they couldn't hide the humiliation they felt. They questioned her, demanding to know who had given their family a bad reputation. The girl initially kept silent. She wants to protect the boy she loves, who is gentle but not strong enough to withstand social pressure. She understands that if the truth is revealed, his future may be shattered, and their love will be buried under malicious rumors. But her parents' anger grew, and the pressure was so pent up that she could no longer bear it. In a moment of panic and despair, when the chaos in her mind stopped her from thinking soberly, she pointed to the only name she thought could withstand the turbulence better than anyone else: Master Hakuin. She knew that while someone else could be ruined, for someone as revered as Hakuin, he would probably stand firm in front of public opinion. It was an impulsive, wrong decision, but made in extreme fear and confusion. Her parents immediately went to Hakuin with a surge of indignation. They expect a strong denial, an explanation, or at least a look of astonishment at being falsely accused. But the master only listened in silence, as if listening to the wind passing through the bamboo rows. When they finished speaking, he only replied softly, "Is that so?" That simple answer made everyone stunned. It is not denial, nor is it an acknowledgement. But for those who are angry, it is more like validation. Rumors spread faster than at the beginning. People began to whisper that it turned out that the revered teacher was just a hypocrite. Overnight, Hakuin's reputation for building a lifetime disintegrates like ashes. The students who had followed him to meditate, who once considered him a master, also left because of disappointment and shame. From being beloved, he became a name that was talked about with contempt. Then the day the child was born, the girl's parents carried the newborn to the door of Hakuin's rustic house, put it in his hands and said coldly, "This is your responsibility. He was his father. Take care of yourself." Master looked at the little child wrapped in a thin cloth and then replied in a calm voice, "Is that so?" He did not object, did not explain, nor asked anyone to intervene. Just like that, he took on the responsibility of raising the child as if it were really his own. From that day, his life changed completely. He wakes up earlier to prepare milk, change diapers, lull the baby to sleep. Late at night, when the crying sounded, he walked slowly across the small room, picked up the child, and soothed him. Neighbors who used to bring him food are now avoiding him. Someone threw him a judgmental look. Someone pretended not to see him when he passed by. But he did not complain, nor did he reproach. His mind was still as calm as underground water, unstirred by the winds outside. Meanwhile, the young girl begins to bear the real weight of the lie. As the days passed, guilt ate away at her heart like a persistent fire. She knew Master Hakuin was facing humiliation, misunderstanding, and isolation because of her wrong words. Yet he still cared for the baby with all the love a father could have. That made her even more unbearable. One evening, when things got too heavy, she burst into tears and confessed everything to her parents. Her parents were confused and in pain. They realized that they had taken out their anger on an innocent person who had accepted the burden of injustice without complaint. They rushed to the master's house with extreme remorse. They knelt down before him and said in a choked voice, "Master, we have done you wrong. Our daughter has confessed that he is not the father of the child. You have suffered a lot because of our mistakes. Please forgive us, and please let us bring the baby back. Master Hakuin listened to them with the same calmness as when he first heard the accusation. Then he gently threw the baby into their arms and said, "Is that so?" That sentence once again silenced them. It doesn't blame, it doesn't judge, it doesn't recall what he's been through. For him, when things come, he accepts them, and when things go, he let go. He did not cling nor resisted. Like the river flowing through many rapids, the waterfall still retains the soft nature of the water. As the Buddha's wisdom once taught, hatred does not end with hatred, but only by love. Hakuin lived it, not with words, but by his presence throughout the ordeal. This story leaves a profound lesson about maintaining inner balance, regardless of how others see us. We often let other people's opinions dominate our emotions. A compliment makes us happy. A criticism makes us sad. An accusation makes us angry. We cut off a part of our mind control for others without realizing it. But Hakuin didn't. He did not let praise bring him up, nor did he let criticism drag him down. He stood in the middle, firmly. Zen Buddhism calls it the immovable mind. Not insensitivity, but freedom from the constraints of circumstances. We react strongly to humiliation or falsely accused because we want to be protected. But when the ego is seen as an illusion, what others say or think is just a breeze outside the door, unable to blow up the peaceful house inside. Hakuin shows us that true value does not lie in reputation or external validation, but in self-understanding. His peace came from within, from freedom from the need to prove or explain. Try to look at yourself. How much of the suffering we are carrying actually does not come from the event that happened, but from the way we react to it? A criticism doesn't hurt us. What hurts us is the part of us that wants to be praised, to be recognized. When we are misunderstood, we feel insulted because we believe that others must understand us correctly. Witnessing Hakuin, we learn that we can choose not to let our emotions get carried away. Between fairness and injustice, between praise and criticism, between right and wrong, we can still keep our center. When life puts us in a situation of being judged, misunderstood, we may remember, so what? Not to deny responsibility, but to remind ourselves that our emotions are not necessarily controlled by circumstances. In the midst of that moment, we can find a small but important space where we choose to react. Freedom of the soul lies in that choice. As the Buddha once said, "You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by that very anger." Hakuin doesn't burden himself with resentment or a desperate attempt to prove himself. He allowed things to happen and then let it go. And from that passing, he kept his peace. Spiritual growth is not how well life treats us, but how we respond to life. Only when we are not caught up in the whirlwind of praise, right and wrong, gain and loss, can we be truly free. Like a bamboo tree that is soft but never breaks, people are only stable when they know how to bow to the wind without losing their inner core. Hakuin's story is not only a story of equanimity, but also a story of absolute compassion, accepting injustice to avoid hurting others, raising a child who is not his own without complaint. It is not weakness, but real strength. The strength of a soul that is not shaken by a thunderstorm. And if at any point you have been judged, misunderstood, criticized for no reason, remember the image of the old teacher holding the baby in his arms, in the midst of rumors like an arrow shooting at him, and he just smiled and asked, "Is that so?" In that question is a whole quiet universe where all the turbulence turns into fine dust that falls on the soul that has been illuminated by wisdom. Amidst the serene mountains that surround Lake Hakone, where the morning mist is as light as breath and the pines whisper like ancient chanting, there is a large monastery that is famous throughout Japan for its rigorous practice and profound wisdom passed down through generations. Among the monks who lived there was a humble man named Ichi, who served in the kitchen all his life, and whose story shows the tenuous but decisive difference between seeking and truly understanding. For 55 years, Ichi worked quietly by the monastery's fireplace. When other monks meditate in long sessions or engage in eloquent debates about the scriptures, Ichi cuts vegetables, washes pots, makes fires, seasons them, and prepares each meal with unwavering devotion. His hands were calloused and stained with time, and his back bent down after winters of hard labor. But never once did he work reluctantly. His every action was calm, alert, and attentive, as if it were the most sacred ritual of his monastic life. However, deep down, Ichi carries a heavy feeling that no one knows. From the very beginning of his entry into meditation, he was given a kokom, a paradoxical question used to break the limits of thought and open the mind. What is the sound of a clapping hand? That question followed him like a shadow. Day after day, year after year, Ichi wrestled with this work in every way he could think of. Logic there, intuition there. Imagination, yes. He persevered in contemplation as he cooked, murmured it as he chopped vegetables, chewed it over and over again when he lit a fire, and let it flow through his mind on quiet nights. But for decades, he still didn't have an answer. As old age approaches, Ichi begins to see himself as a failure. He watched young monks come to the monastery, were given new courts, broke them, and was praised by the teacher for their perseverance. He sees those who come after him eventually surpass him, continuing to advance to deeper levels in his practice. And he, after 55 years, was still stomping on the spot in the first court. Many times, stirring a large pot of soup, he whispered, 55 years, and I still can't hear the sound of a hand. That question became a thorn in his soul, making him constantly wonder about his helplessness. At that time, Ichi's health was deteriorating. He was moved to a small room upstairs, where he no longer had to work hard and could rest in silence. The last days of his life came not with fear, but with the slowness of the sunset falling on the top of the mountain. And it was then that the unexpected began to happen. Lying on a simple bamboo bed, listening to the wind sweeping through the tiled roof and the sound of temple bells echoing in the distance from the lower courtyard, Ichi felt a small but very profound change. Slowly, one of the greatest burdens of his life, his intense desire to solve the court, began to dissipate. No more despair, no more shame because you feel inferior, no more stress every time you remember a question that has been unanswered for decades. Everything gradually dissipated like a mist dispelled by the early sun. Where striving once reigned, suddenly a gap as light as silk appeared. And in that void, a deep peace pours in, calm like a stream flowing through green moss. It's not like victory, nor is it like surrender. It was like a gentle embrace that embraced his whole being. Tired hands, a curved back, a torn heart, and years of hopeless searching. His breathing slowed, strangely serene. The thoughts that had once been chaotic, that had clung to him all his life, now faded and disappeared. And it was in the silence so deep that it seemed as if the world had stopped. that Ichi heard what he had been looking for 55 years. He hears the sound of a hand clapping, not through his ears, not a physical noise, but as a pure unity between him and the whole of being. It is not the sound that comes from outside, but the clarity that is always present beneath all the noise of thought. The answer is not generated. It came to light when all attempts to track it down were silent. The Buddha once said, "Stop clinging to ideas and you will see the truth." Ichi realized that enlightenment is not something we attain with constant effort, but something that is revealed when the last effort melts away. When the seeker disappears, what is sought immediately appears. Why do we struggle to the point of exhaustion when it is the same struggle that prevents us from reaching what we want? The mind always creates divisions. One side is the seeker. The other is the object to be sought, and between the two sides is the endless distance that we try to hold on to with our will. But when we let go, that distance disappears. Ichi finally passed his canon not by solving it, but by no longer needing to solve it. That is the beginner mind that Zen often refers to. Pure awareness exists before we turn it into a goal, an achievement. For 55 years, Ichi's idyllic presence as he cut vegetables and washed pots contained what he thought he had to achieve with hard work. The more he tried to seek enlightenment as an object to attain, the further he became away from the natural clarity that was always with him. We often make the same mistake. We turn joy into the pursuit of happiness. We complicate love with the expectation of the right person at the right time. We mask our natural wisdom by the never-ending accumulation of knowledge. But sometimes the deepest thing comes not from action, but from a willingness not to act. Ichi's work is not a puzzle that needs to be solved, but an invitation to settle down in a static space before thoughts take shape. And in the last moment of his life, when there was only pure listening, he heard what he had been looking for all his life. That sound didn't come from anywhere. It is the very life that is knowing itself through him. When you think about your spiritual journey, remember the old cook's last discovery. Maybe it's the awareness that is watching your search that you've been looking for all along. The sound of a clapping hand is probably never far from you. It is right in listening, right in the stillness between the two breaths. As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Don't look for it outside. And sometimes the greatest achievement is the ability to stop searching, to realize that what we expect has never left us. In the journey to find awakening that people have been diligently pursuing for generations, there are stories that seem simple but hide a profound truth about the vague but dangerous gap between conceptual understanding and direct life experience. One of these stories is the anecdote of the one-eyed monk and the silent debate, a story that was passed down in the Zen monasteries of ancient China, where traveling between monasteries was not only for rest, but also for the intellectual and spiritual testing of the seekers. At that time, a special custom was formed. Any wandering monk who wanted to spend the night in a monastery had to enter into a Buddhist dialogue, a contest not of strength or loud debate, but of measuring the depth of spiritual intuition, often through paradoxical questions or metaphorical gestures. Such encounters can be very brief, but they are like an arrow that pierces the essence of the mind, exposing the other person who really understands or is just swimming in an empty concept. One afternoon, as the sun was falling on the soaring bamboo trees that surrounded a famous monastery, a traveling monk appeared at the gate. He was tired after many days of crossing the mountains and forests. His robe was stained with dust on the long road. His straw sandals were torn almost all of his heel. But in his eyes, there was still the light of a man who persistently searched for the truth. The abbot of the monastery, who was busy with evening work, was unable to receive him in person according to the usual ceremony. So he entrusted the reception and testing of the traveling monk to his own servant. This servant was a monk who had lived for many years in the monastery, devoted, humble, and quiet. Although he lost an eye to an accident as a child, he became deeper on the path of study, as if his external defect opened an inner door. When the two met in the reception hall, the itinerant monk folded his hands, smiled, and suggested something unusual. "Let's have a quiet debate," he said, gently gesturing that they would only use gestures to convey their understanding. The waiter nodded, agreeing with the usual calmness in monks who were used to living in silence. And so the wordless debate began. The traveler raises a finger, his hand pointing straight to the sky, making a decisive gesture, as if he were proclaiming an absolute truth. Without hesitation, the waiter responded by raising 2 fingers, his eyes calm. Seemingly satisfied with the answer, the traveling monk continued, raising 3 fingers. This time, the waiter did not respond with his scattered fingers anymore, but clenched his hand into a fist, bringing it forward as some strong affirmation. The wanderer's confidence suddenly disappeared. His eyes widened, and there was a glimmer of confusion and something almost frightened. Without saying another word, he bowed his head deeply and left the hall quickly, as if he had witnessed something beyond comprehension. He turned to the abbot and spoke respectfully, but could not hide his disappointment. "Sir, your representative is too eruditive. I'm not qualified to stay here tonight. I should continue my journey." Hearing this, the abbot raised his eyebrows slightly, motioning for him to narrate the silent exchange. The traveling monk explains carefully, as if describing a philosophical essay. "When I raise a finger, I am signifying the Buddha, the only enlightened teacher." But his man immediately raised 2 fingers, representing the Buddha and the Dharma, the teacher and the teachings. I raised 3 fingers to complete the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But then he raised his fist, which meant that the 3 were not separated, but merged into a single truth. You see, his understanding is far beyond mine. When the monk left, the abbot was still standing there thinking, and then his servant ran in, his face flushed with anger. "Master, where has that rude man gone? I searched for him everywhere and couldn't find him." The abbot calmly asked what had happened to make the servant, who was notoriously gentle, so angry. The servant immediately recounted, his voice getting higher and higher with indignation. "He disrespected me from the beginning. He held up a finger, obviously reminding me that I only have 1 eye. It's so rude to pretend to discuss the Buddhist Dharma." But I responded politely with 2 fingers, meaning that he had 2 eyes and that I didn't mind him mentioning my defect. But he didn't stop. He held up 3 fingers, obviously wanting to emphasize that between the 2 of us there are only 3 eyes. He deliberately embarrassed me. At that time, I couldn't bear it all, so I held my hand and warned him, but he ran away cowardly. After listening, the abbot was silent for a long time, clearly feeling the wonder and irony of the human mind. The same event, the same series of gestures, but 2 people witness 2 completely different realities. One person sees it as an eloquent exchange about the 3 jewels, about the ultimate unity. The other sees personal insults, ridicule of shortcomings, and old pain stirred up again. The Buddha once taught, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are." And this story is the most vivid proof of that. Each person's mind is a lens filled with experiences, hurts, aspirations, prejudices, and desires. The servant, carrying the guilt of the eyes lost in childhood, is accustomed to being looked upon with pity or contempt. These memories became a layer of dust on the face of his mirror of perception. When the traveling monk raised a finger, the dust immediately made him understand it in a way that was conducive to his fears. The traveling monk, on the other hand, has a thirst for enlightenment and a habit of deducing symbols into profound meanings. He couldn't imagine that the person in front of him was angry or hurt because he thought that everyone in the monastery understood the Dharma. So he viewed the other's increasingly grumpy gestures as subtle, meditative answers. In that encounter, no one really understood the other. They only see themselves reflected in the actions of their opponents. These are what Zen Buddhism calls worldly winds: praise, loss, honor and disgrace, joy and suffering. They are the winds that blow through each person's heart, shaping the way we interpret the world. When the mind is swayed by the wind, everything that is neutral becomes tinged with subjective emotions. The story of the two monks reminds us that conceptual knowledge and real-life experience can be as different as heaven and earth. Some people can explain the doctrine all day long, but can't see the anger that is rising within themselves. Some people memorize the scriptures, but still misunderstand a look, a gesture, a word. And it is these misunderstandings that create a multitude of consequences in everyday life. We think that others are insulting us when they don't mean it. We think someone is rejecting us while they are just busy. We think we're abandoned when the truth is that our minds are telling an old story. Meditation indicates that to live in concept is to live away from the truth. Truth only appears when the mind becomes empty, unbound by existing judgments. A one-finger gesture can be as simple as a finger. But when the mind embraces prejudice, a tiny finger can become a symbol of ridicule or ultimate truth. It's not that the world changes, it's that our own minds change. And finally, this story teaches us to look back at ourselves every time we think we understand someone. Are we seeing them with clear eyes or just with the darkness within us? Are we reacting to reality or to memory? Are we facing others, or are we just arguing with the image created by our mind? Because there is always a gap between knowledge and reality. That gap only disappears when we quietly look deeply into ourselves. Only then can we stop interpreting things with fear or desire and begin to see the world as it really is, pure, simple, and not against us. Imagine that in every seemingly simple moment of our lives, we are constantly looking at the world through invisible lenses honed by anxiety, hurt, hope, and private memories that we often don't even realize. How many times has a look, a statement, or an action by someone else made you jump to a conclusion, only to realize that what you thought was completely untrue? Have you ever misunderstood a loved one's silence for separation, only to find out that they are dealing with the anxiety of someone in the family's illness? Or does a well-meaning suggestion from a colleague become a criticism in your eyes, just because you are carrying a burden of insecurity about your own abilities? Those things happen so often that they almost become human nature. We think we're seeing the world as it is, but in fact, most of the time, we're just seeing the world bent into the shape of our inner feelings, desires, and fears. Ancient stories have reminded us of this. Two people can see the same event, but see two completely different realities. Both are sincere. Both believe in what they see, but both can be wrong. Not because they're lying or deliberately misunderstanding, but because the psychic glasses they're wearing in their eyes are so familiar that they no longer know they're wearing them. The big question is, how do we see better so that the world is no longer exaggerated by fear, no longer colored by personal desire? Meditation offers a number of suggestions, and among them, the most important is the so-called unknowing mind, a state that allows us to admit that our initial interpretation may not be accurate. Instead of hastily concluding that someone is apathetic, intentionally offensive, or disrespectful, we pause, gently asking, what other possibilities are there? Maybe he has a headache, is stressed, is worried about something that we don't know? When we do so, we open up space for truth, not for the defenses of the ego. Another method is mindfulness of the very emotions that are rising within us. When the waiter in the old story feels ashamed of his appearance, that sensitivity leads him to interpret a carefree remark as an insult. If he had been aware of that fragility, he could have stopped and wondered, maybe what I'm hearing isn't what he wants to say. Similarly, the traveler, because he was so eager to seek the teachings, took a very ordinary behavior as a sign of deep enlightenment. If he had recognized the thirst for enlightenment that was driving him, he might have wondered, am I seeing wisdom where there is nothing special? Zen masters once taught that it is your daily mind that is the path. This teaching reminds us to stop trying to trace the secret meanings of each event, and instead look at the machine that produces those meanings, our own minds. The Buddha also said, hatred is never appeased by hatred. Only by not holding grudges can hatred be appeased. This is the eternal law. If the waiter had responded to the imagined insult with curiosity instead of defensiveness, if the traveler had questioned his speculation instead of being sure of it, the encounter between them could have become a valuable lesson for both. At the end of the day, as you reminisce about the conversations that have passed, you may realize how many times your emotions have painted a completely different picture than what actually happened. Can you distinguish which are objective facts and which are the mind stories you have added? As the Buddha reminded, peace comes from within. Don't look for it outside. When we understand that our inner weather determines storms or sunny days in the outside world, we open the door to the possibility of seeing more clearly, a clarity that nurtures both wisdom and compassion. In the same spirit, there is another Zen story that tells of the direct transmission of truth, something that even the most subtle words can hardly replace. The story takes place in a bustling city, where the shouts of vendors are mingled with the debates of scholars in quaint tea houses. There, Zen Master Bankai, who is widely known for his keen intuition and ability to point directly at his listeners' Buddha nature, has just finished a lecture at a large temple. He lived a simple life, carrying only a few necessary items, and often moved from temple to teach those who really wanted to learn. As he was preparing to leave for his next destination, an elegantly dressed man walked over. His iridescent silk robe and cautious demeanor suggest that he worked for an influential aristocratic family. With a polite voice tinged with pleading, he bowed his head and said that the Baron, a man of great learning and sincere interest in the Dharma, was eager to see Bankai. But unexpected work made it impossible for him to be present that day. The Baron begged the Zen master to postpone the trip for a day so that he could have a chance to talk. Although he knew in his heart that a group of students were waiting at the next temple, Bankai understood that a sincere seeker always deserved help. He nodded, agreeing to stay for one more day. That evening, he unwrapped his wrapper, went back to the sanctuary, and meditated in silence. He prepares for tomorrow's meeting, believing that he will talk to someone who truly desires to delve into the nature of the mind. The morning came with the sound of the pagoda bell echoing. As the appointment time approached, Bankai sat in the small reception room. But it wasn't the Baron who entered. Instead, it was the man who was dressed properly yesterday, this time with a guilty expression. He bowed his head and sighed, announcing that the Baron had been called away again because of the urgency of state business. However, he did not forget his desire to learn. Therefore, he sent this servant to take his place, to listen to Bankai's teachings and pass them on to him honestly. The messenger reported that the Baron wished for an explanation of the nature of the mind, what consciousness really is, and how it could be realized directly, not conceptually. He promised to memorize every word to convey it. Bankai looked at him silently. His silence was not anger, but a deep sense of the whole situation. An absent person seeking wisdom, one who was present, but not really the one who needed to hear, and the almost absurd demand of communicating the truth through the middle hand. Finally, he said softly, with his characteristic directness, "Impossible." The man was surprised and hurriedly asked the reason. Bankai replied, "True understanding of the mind cannot be transmitted from one person to another like giving a letter. What I tell you will not be what the Baron hears. What you understand is not what I preach. And what the Baron thought he understood was not true." He continued, his voice still calm. "If the Baron really wants to know the nature of his mind, he must be present himself. He has to sit here, in this moment, with his own breath, with his own stillness. No one can replace that." The man bowed his head, understanding that he had just been taught a lesson that perhaps the Baron himself needed to hear. Truth cannot be carried for him. Enlightenment cannot be sent through the hands of others. When the messenger left, Bankai just quietly packed his luggage, ready to continue his journey. He knew that perhaps the Baron would come to see him on another occasion. And then, if he were indeed present, the lesson would come at the right time. And so in both stories, from simple misunderstandings in everyday life to the sublime quests of those who bear the name of nobility, the lesson is the same. To see the truth clearly, we must be present with ourselves, seeing the world through a distorted lens. And most of all, no one can see for me. Clarity does not come from outside. It grows from within, from the stillness where we are humble enough to admit that we don't know, and courageous enough to look directly into our mind as it is. The problem of meditation is really a difficult thing to communicate, even when teachers and students meet face to face and exchange questions and answers. The difficulty is multiplied when we want to convey it through a messenger, no matter how sincere and capable that person may be. It is impossible to convey the essence of meditation. After giving an answer, the owner of the story just sat quietly, not saying anything more. That silence is a meditation lesson that he wants to impart. The other man, who had been waiting for a deeper explanation or alternative suggestions, finally fell silent, bowed politely, and withdrew from the temple, a hint of speechless confusion in his heart. The Buddha once taught, "Be a lamp to yourself." And this lesson embodies a profound truth that Bankai, the Zen master in the story, conveys with his gentle but firm refusal. The wisdom of meditation cannot be condensed into a message that can be carried through a representative. Spiritual awakening is not information that can be communicated, but transformation that must be experienced directly. Why do we often approach spiritual learning as if it were a form of academic knowledge, which can be collected, memorized, and passed on through an intermediary? Zen Buddhism teaches that awakening is not a concept to be understood, but a reality to be experienced directly. Just like drinking water for thirsty people, it is impossible to adequately describe the feeling of coolness and refreshment when drinking water. It must be a personal experience, a living experience that only oneself can feel. The Baron's question about the nature of consciousness is also an expression of the usual approach to spiritual inquiry. We want to understand consciousness with the intellect, with the grasp of concepts, in order to possess it as a kind of knowledge. But consciousness cannot become an independent object of study because it is the subject being studied. It's like trying to see our eyes without a mirror, because looking itself is what we're trying to realize. Think about how many times throughout the day we actually approach spiritual wisdom as a living truth rather than as information to gather. We read books about meditation instead of meditation, studying descriptions of enlightenment instead of investigating one's current experience, seeking answers about the nature of the mind instead of directly examining the experience itself, called the mind. Zen Master Dogen once taught that to learn how to Buddha is to learn to study oneself. And study oneself is actually to forget oneself. This paradox is at the heart of why spiritual communication requires direct involvement. The ego wants to understand Buddhism intellectually, but it is itself a structure that must be seen. This insight is not through the accumulation of knowledge, but through the profound investigation of direct experience. The messenger in the story represents our common tendency to approach awakening indirectly. We want to understand consciousness from a safe distance, maintaining the illusion that we are separate observers studying an object called awareness. But awareness is not something we can possess, understand, or communicate because we are the manifestation of it. Bankai's silence after his brief explanation became a profound teaching in itself. In meditation, silence often conveys things that words can't express. It is the space between thoughts, the space between the breaths, the very awareness in which all experiences arise. These things cannot be grasped in words, but can be recognized directly when we stop trying to conceptualize them. This does not mean that there cannot be spiritual teaching, or that the role of the professor is superfluous. In contrast, authentic teaching is about directing students to their own direct experience, rather than providing descriptions of other people's perceptions. The teacher's role is not to give students enlightenment, but to enable them to realize that they already have it. One evening, when you experience the simple fact of consciousness, awareness of these words, awareness of your body, awareness of the space where thoughts and sensations arise, can you investigate that awareness directly rather than through concepts? Can you be fully present with your experience instead of trying to understand it in the words of others? The Buddha once taught to carry out salvation by yourself with diligence, because the path to freedom cannot pass through any representative. It requires your own feet, your own breath, and your own willingness to look straight at what you've always been, but may never have seen. Let us now explore another story of the difference between obedience and true understanding. The story is about the arrogant priest and the gentle teacher, Bankai. Master Bank has gained a wide reputation in the region. Unlike other teachers who often use complex philosophical arguments or quote ancient texts at length, Bankai speaks directly from his heart to the hearts of his listeners. His words were simple but profound, accessible to both farmers and scholars. All walks of life, merchants, servants, samurai, priests, gathered to hear him speak about the natural peace that exists in every human being. The growing reputation of the master began to cause trouble for a priest of the Nichiren sect, whose temple gradually became empty as the believer left to listen to Zen. This priest builds his identity on the knowledge, respect, and obedience of others. He prides himself on his biblical knowledge and ability to win theological debates. The idea that a simple Zen master could attract a disciple with such simple words was a personal insult to him. Determined to expose the shallow doctrine disguised under the intellectual layer, Father Nichiren stormed into one of Bankai's gatherings. He squeezed through the listening crowd, his robe fluttering, his face stern, full of indignation. The peaceful atmosphere suddenly became tense as everyone turned to look. "Hey, Zen Master!" the priest cried out, his voice echoing, deliberately rude, unmistakable. He treated his respected teacher like an ordinary street circus performer. "Wait a minute, I have something to tell you." Bankai calmly looked up from her seat, showing no signs of discomfort or defensiveness. His eyes gently gave the same attention as ever to everyone who approached, whether with a sincere question or a hostile challenge. "Everyone here respects me and will obey whatever I say," the priest continued, his voice louder, warmer at the challenge. "But I don't respect you at all. Can you make me obey you? Can your so-called wisdom make someone like me see through your simple tricks?" The crowd held its breath, waiting for an angry reaction or an educated rejection to put the challenger in his place. But Bankai just smiled warmly, really curious. "Please come to my side," he said softly. "I'll show you." The priest, confident in his ability to expose any manipulation, proudly pushed the crowd toward the front of the stage. He stood next to his teacher's simple cushion, his chest bulging with confidence and arrogance, ready to show his independence from that supposed power. "Thank you," Bankai said with the same gentle smile. "Now we can hear each other better if you stand to my left. Please come here." Without thinking, the priest moved to the left. Bankai continued to ponder, "Maybe we'll be more explicit if you're on my right side. Do you mind moving there?" Again, the priest automatically complied. It was just a small adjustment, so logical that he didn't realize he was following instructions. Bankai's smile deepened, and his eyes sparkled with gentle enjoyment. "You see," he said, "you've obeyed me, and I think you're really a very gentle, cooperative person. Now, please sit down and listen to what I have to say." The priest stood stiff, suddenly realizing what had just happened. He came with the intention of demonstrating independence and superiority, but unwittingly revealed his natural cooperation with decent and reasonable demands. His entire thesis dissolved, not by force or sharp rhetoric, but by his own unconscious behavior. The crowd remained silent, but many tried not to smile because they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not humiliation, but gentle revelation. The master has shown that true influence does not come from demanding obedience, but from the invitation to natural cooperation. The priest felt his anger and arrogance dissipate, replaced by unexpected curiosity. How could this simple man turn a hostile confrontation into a moment of mutual understanding without saying a word or asserting his authority? Still stunned, the priest sat down. As Bankai continued to speak, the words seemed to pass through his analytical mind, touching the heart directly. For the first time in years, he listened not to find fault or prepare for criticism, but simply to listen. The Buddha's wisdom tells us, true obedience is not blind obedience, but conscious harmony. This ancient wisdom illuminates the difference between compulsory compliance from fear or social pressure and natural cooperation that arises from true understanding. Why do we often confuse power with authoritarianism, influence with coercion? Zen Buddhism points out that we are still bound by the conditions around power, the idea that in order to get others to cooperate, we need to use force, manipulate, or assert superiority. The most profound lesson here, however, is that true leadership comes from understanding human nature, not from taming it. The priest came looking for someone who would dominate him, as that was the only power model he knew. But instead, he met someone who invited natural cooperation. The entire framework of understanding his power and influence is gently challenged. Think about your own experience with power. Which teachers, bosses, or leaders have had the most positive influence in your life? Do they demand respect by force or earn it by invoking the good nature within you? The difference is profound. Compulsory compliance breeds resentment and resistance, while voluntary cooperation creates real change. In everyday relationships, we often fall into the same trap as the priest, thinking that in order to get what we want, we must dominate others. We prepare debates. We set up defenses. We are ready to fight. But Bankai's way suggests a different path. What if we believed in the best in others and invited their natural wisdom to emerge? Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once wrote, "When someone else makes you suffer, it is because he suffers deeply within himself, and his suffering is overflowing." The priest's aggression stemmed from the insecurity and fear of being pushed back within him. Bankai's talent lies in seeing the pain beneath the mask of hostility and reacting to that pain instead of with aggression. This does not mean being passive or allowing abuse. Bankai kept clear boundaries, not accepting the priest's request for debate, but redirecting the energy of the meeting into a constructive lesson. The Buddha taught, hatred can never be appeased by hatred in this world. Only by not hating can hatred be appeased. This is the eternal law. That principle applies not only to explicit hatred, but also to all forms of conflict and resistance. When we encounter resistance and respond with resistance, we only create more tension. But if we respond with understanding, we create space for transformation. Tonight, as you look back on relationships, situations where you felt the need to assert your will or defend your stance, can you remember the gentle teacher who never commanded obedience, but received full cooperation? Can you invite the natural wisdom of others instead of trying to overcome their resistance? As the Buddha observed, separation is the greatest pain in the world, and compassion is the real strength of the world. True authority does not come from the power to make others obey, but from the wisdom that helps them discover their own desire to cooperate, to create something beautiful together. This story is a lesson in meditation, of awakening, not something that can be communicated through words, but must be lived and experienced firsthand. It is an invitation to each person to find the light in himself, not to wait for others to bring the light. And also a reminder of the power of compassion and sincere cooperation in every aspect of life, from meditation to power, from learning to everyday relationships. Let's continue our journey with the story of the two monks and the woman by the river. A simple story that contains a profound lesson about the difference between sincere help and rigid adherence to the rules. The two monks, the two companions, traveled together on a mountain road that led to a remote monastery, where they planned to continue their studies and spiritual training. Both were strictly ordained, including an oath to avoid physical contact with women, a rule not out of stigma, but intended to help them focus entirely on spiritual growth. They understand that such precepts, however strict, are not to bind them, but to raise awareness and diligence in meditation. As they approached a river that was rising due to recent storms, the wooden bridge that normally led to it had been destroyed. The two monks saw a young woman standing quietly on the water's edge, looking worried and uneasy. The river was fast flowing. The water was turbid, full of debris from the mountains, and it was clear that she could not cross safely on her own. She exclaimed, "Please, venerable monks, can any of you help me through these dangerous waters? I don't have the strength to do it myself." The cry for help was filled with despair and the need for immediate help. The first monk immediately felt his mind run wild, worried about the monastic rules they had to follow. Physical contact with women is strictly forbidden in their precepts, and he begins to explain why they can't help her, even suggesting other options that don't violate the precepts. But the second monk, seeing the woman's real fear and danger, walked over without hesitation and gently carried her on his shoulders. He carefully walked through the fast-flowing water, making sure she was safe every step of the way. And when he reached the other side, he gently laid her down, receiving a deep thank you from the girl before they continued on their way. Although the second monk's actions were compassionate and practical, the atmosphere between the two companions changed completely. The first monk walked in silence, his mind filled with conflicting and unsettling thoughts. Now, many hours have passed. His inner tension rises like an unstoppable wave. Finally, he couldn't remain silent anymore, bursting up with confusion and anger. "Brother, I can't understand your behavior in the river. Our spiritual training clearly teaches us that we must avoid all physical contact with women. Yet he carried her on his shoulders and carried her through the water like that. How can you violate our sacred oath so blatantly?" The companion looked at him with gentle eyes and replied in a very simple but profound way. "Brother, I put her on the other side of the river a few hours ago, but you are still carrying her." That quote sounds like a wake-up call, a lesson in how we hold on to negative emotions and past events, not allowing ourselves to be free. The Buddha's wisdom taught that holding on to anger is like holding on to a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else, but it is you who gets burned. The story of the two monks and the woman by the river reveals the subtle but important difference between genuine acts of compassion and rigid clinging, between meeting current needs and carrying the burden of past events. We often carry with us situations that have passed for a long time, constantly replaying in our minds the scenarios that have ended, nurturing feelings of grievance or regret that exist only in our memory. In Zen Buddhism, this is better understood. Much of our suffering does not come from objective facts, but from our inability to let go of experiences once they have passed. The first monk is the most obvious example. He sticks to strict rules, but is unable to free his mind from the tormenting thoughts that last for hours, making things even heavier. This makes us think about ourselves. Do we often repeat the same old conversations, holding on to old conflicts or hurts that should have been left behind? How much mental energy is wasted by continuing to hold on to memories or events that only exist in the past? Meanwhile, the present moment, with all its riches and potential, is forgotten, not appreciated because we are too preoccupied with the ghosts of the past. Meditation teaches us to distinguish between acting appropriately, in accordance with the situation, and unnecessary clinging that hurts the soul. The second monk did it very naturally. Help the woman when she needed it, then continue the journey without holding anything back. He doesn't care if the action is right or wrong in the eyes of others, doesn't pay attention to judgments, doesn't embrace those facts in his mind. The Zen master teaches that thanks to impermanence, everything can change and end. The act of crossing a river is the same. It begins, serves its purpose, and then ends. The attachment of the first monk is what creates the persistent pain. The Buddha once taught, let go of what is past. Let go of what may happen. Let go of what's happening right now. Don't try to figure out anything. Don't try to make anything happen. Relax now and rest. This teaching directs us to true freedom that is only possible when we stop carrying with us experiences that have exceeded their natural lifespan. Try to look deeply at what we are still holding on to unnecessarily. Old resentments, mistakes of the past, harsh words of others long ago, moments of shame or regret that even others have forgotten. All of these things only exist because we continue to pick them up and carry them with us. What does it feel like when we put them down? The irony of the story is that the monk who actually broke the rules is not the one who suffers, and the monk who strictly follows it is the one who causes his own suffering. This shows that, many times, suffering is not caused by our actions, but by our thoughts and reactions to that action that create it. When we know how to let go and live with freedom in our minds, we can truly experience peace and well-being. It is a lesson that the two monks by the river taught us. A lesson that goes beyond precepts and rules, transcends even physical constraints, leading to an understanding of true compassion and liberation from the invisible burdens of the soul. Tonight, when you notice your mind returning to past events, old grievances, or situations that have ended, try to remember the example of the wise monk in the story told. Can you practice putting down whatever you're carrying unnecessarily to discover the lightness of traveling through life without being burdened by yesterday's experiences? As the Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, only three things really matter: how well we lived, how well we loved, and how well we learned to let go. True spiritual practice is not about following a rigid rule of perfection, but about reacting appropriately to what is present at that moment, and then completely freeing it up to make space for whatever happens next. As we continue our journey through Zen Buddhism's wisdom, we move on to another teaching, which is about the temporary nature of all possessions and things we supposedly possess. The story begins in an ancient land of India, where a famous spiritual teacher spent years wandering from village to village, sharing the Buddha's teachings with anyone who wanted to listen. His reputation for wisdom and compassion spread throughout the country, reaching the ears of both powerful kings and nobles. One day, during his trip, the teacher arrived in the capital of a powerful kingdom, where a magnificent palace rose above the bustling streets like a brilliant jewel-encrusted crown. That palace is truly a wonder to behold, with walls built of the finest marble, gemstone mosaics that catch light and reflect the sun in vibrantly colored waterfalls. Gardens filled with exotic flowers and gurgling fountains surround it, while warriors in gleaming armor stand solemn guard throughout the grounds. It was obvious that this was the residence of a ruler of great wealth and power. The divine teacher approached the main gate with the calm demeanor that he brought to every meeting, whether with the king or the beggar. The guards, recognizing him by his simple cloak and serene serenity, did not move to stop him. News of his visit came first, and they were ordered to allow him to pass. Passing through the silk-carpeted corridors and splendid golden statues, the teacher headed straight for the throne room, where the king sat on an intricately carved chair on a marble floor. Courtiers in luxurious clothes gathered around the throne, jewels gleaming in the light from soaring windows. The king, a middle-aged man dressed in a dark purple silk robe and a crown of gold and diamonds, looked up as the teacher entered the room. He had been looking forward to this visit, although it was unclear what would happen during this meeting. "What do you want?" asked the king bluntly, his voice full of the authority of one accustomed to obedience and instant answers. The teacher bowed respectfully, but said with gentle confidence, "Your Majesty, I want a place to sleep in this inn." A wave of surprise spread through the courtiers. The king's eyebrows were raised, and his expression changed from curiosity to confusion. "But this is not an inn," he replied, pointing to the lavish surroundings. "This is my palace." He was the ruler of the kingdom, and it was the center of royal power for generations. The teacher nodded thoughtfully, seemingly considering the information carefully. "I understand. May I ask your Majesty, who owned this palace before you?" "My father," the king replied, his voice somewhat defensive. "He ruled for 30 years. Died. This palace used to be years before he died. This palace used to be a seat of, as well as mine now." The teacher went on to ask, "So who owned it before him?" "My grandfather," replied the king, beginning to feel curious and also a little anxious about the direction of the story. "He also sat on this throne, and he's passed away too." The teacher paused for a moment, letting the words seep into the air in the large, ornately decorated room. The courtiers were silent, feeling the seriousness of the dialogue. Even the king couldn't help but wait for the teacher's next answer. Finally, in a clear voice, full of understanding, the teacher said, "This place is just a place for people to live for a short time and then continue the journey." He turned to the king and added, "I heard you say that this is not an inn?" Silence enveloped the throne room. The king sat motionless on his throne. His teacher's words seemed to penetrate through the cover of power and fame that he had never doubted. The courtiers remained still, seemingly witnessing something beyond the usual understanding of royal etiquette and worldly power. The Buddha once taught, "All things that are conditioned are impermanent. Be diligent in your salvation." This profound truth is clearly revealed by the teacher's sharp question about the inn that calls itself the palace. Why do we cling so intensely to possessions and status that are temporary, which will have to be left behind? Zen Buddhism explains that our attachment to eternity creates suffering. because it is in complete contradiction to the basic reality of impermanence. Everything we think of as ours, from our bodies and identities to our homes, vehicles, job titles, or bank account balances, is a temporary arrangement. We live in it for a while, and then we go on with our lives like everyone else before us, and there will be others after us who go through the same thing. This does not mean that we should be indifferent or careless about our responsibilities or possessions, but rather invites us to take them more lightly, to understand their transient nature. The king's palace was magnificent and served important functions, but it was unmistakable as a permanent residence. It's just a luxury inn where the occupants stay for a while and then leave again. The deeper lesson shows how identification with temporary roles causes unnecessary suffering. When we forget the impermanent nature of those roles, whether parents, professionals, hosts, or even meditation students, we create anxiety when we try to hold on to what can't be sustained forever. Consider your own attachment, be it your professional identity, relationships, health, or spiritual achievements. Each is precious and worth taking care of, but can also change over time. Executives will retire, parents will become empty, students will become teachers, healthy people will get sick. Those transformations are not failures, but natural manifestations of impermanence. The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." This teaching helps us to change our view of impermanence, no longer seeing it as something to be feared, but as something to be embraced and celebrated. Because nothing lasts forever. A state of suffering can be transformed into joy. A closed heart can be open to love, and even the most rigid patterns can be transformed into profound wisdom. In our meditation practice, we practice what's called non-attachment, that is, caring deeply but maintaining lightness in the soul. This does not mean that we become cold or indifferent, but rather learn to love without clinging, to work without clinging, and to enjoy without demanding eternity. This spiritual teacher's insight penetrates through the illusion that any one of us can be the permanent owner of anything. But in reality, all is impermanent, and letting go is the door to true freedom. Through this, we realize that this life is like a trip through a big inn, where everything comes and goes, and the important thing is not what we hold back, but that we know how to appreciate and let go at the right time so that our journey is lighter and more complete. We are all temporary guests in the inn of being, borrowing our roles and possessions during the short time we live there. This recognition can lead to deep despair or great deliverance, depending on how we receive it. The Buddha once said, "Everything is impermanent. Try to accomplish as many virtues as you can." This doctrine is not a warning about the cruelty of life, but a tender reminder that our precious and short time should not be wasted in vain. We should make use of it wisely to cultivate love, wisdom, and compassion while we can. Tonight, as you rest in your own temporary abode, surrounded by items that are also temporary, can you feel the profound freedom of recognizing the transient nature of all such things? This recognition does not diminish the value of assets or life, but on the contrary, it can increase appreciation and gratitude in your heart. The Buddha once taught that of all the footprints of the elephant are the supreme. Likewise, of all the meditation topics, death is the most important one. When we remember the temporary nature of life, just as we are only temporarily staying in an inn, we discover the urgency and preciousness of each moment given to practicing love and awareness. And in the intellectual journey of Zen Buddhism, we learn to transform our relationship with suffering. There is a famous story in a peaceful monastery nestled among rolling hills where there was an old master who was famous for his patience and deep wisdom. Among his disciples, there was a young man who always carried in his heart incessant lamentations about life's difficulties. Every morning, the student came with a bunch of reasons to complain. "Master, why is life so hard? Yesterday, my meditation was disturbed by noise. Today, my back hurts because the floor is hard. When will this suffering end?" His voice was heavy as the burden of small grievances gathered into a great mountain of misery. The teacher listened with infinite patience, but after a while, he realized that words alone could not change the student's point of view. One cool morning, as the golden sunlight shone through the small door of the modest house, the teacher made an unexpected request. "Dear student, I need you to go into the kitchen and get me some salt. Just a little." The student, though confused by this simple task, was obedient. He returned with a handful of salt. The pure white crystals fit in the palm of his hand. The teacher took out a small glass of water and said, "Put all that salt in this cup and drink it." The disciple hesitated. "Master, it seems that there is too much salt for such a small amount of water." But the teacher replied, "Trust the process. Drink it." The student poured salt into the cup, watching the crystals dissolve into a cloudy, unattractive mixture. He lifted his cup and took a big sip, immediately wincing at the bitter, pungent taste that filled his mouth. "How does it taste?" the teacher asked. "Bitter, terrible, extremely bitter," the student replied, spitting out. The teacher smiled slightly. "Wonderful. Now take that salt with you and come with me." They walked together in silence, contemplation, to the shore of the pristine mountain lake. The lake water is calm like a large mirror, reflecting the clear blue sky. It is difficult to distinguish which is earth and which is sky. "Now, put this handful of salt in the lake," the teacher said. The student stepped into the shallow water, opened his palm, and watched the salt crystals scattered on the surface of the water, quickly dissipating, leaving a clear lake of water with no trace of salt remaining. "Drink water from the lake," the teacher said. The student took the lake water in his hand and took a sip. The water is cool and pure like a mountain spring. "How does it taste?" the teacher asked. "Clean and pure," the student replied in surprise. "Can you taste the salt?" the teacher asked. The student stopped, concentrated his thoughts, and said, "No, I can't taste any salt." The teacher sat next to the disciple on a flat rock at the edge of the lake, his calloused hand grasping the disciple's hand in a deep and gentle way. "Dear disciple, the pain in life is pure salt, nothing more, nothing less. The level of pain is constant, but the level of bitterness we experience depends entirely on the container we put that pain into." The student listened, his eyes lit up with a new understanding. "The only thing you can control," the teacher continued, "is your reaction. You can choose to become a small glass where each grain of salt overwhelms all your senses, or you can expand your consciousness to become a vast lake where salt dissolves harmlessly into it." The teacher stopped. His eyes were gentle. "Don't make glasses anymore, my child. Become a lake." The Buddha once taught, "Pain is certain, suffering is optional." This doctrine reveals the heart of our difficult relationship with life's challenges. We cannot avoid suffering and challenges, but we have great power in deciding how it affects us. Our consciousness is not fixed. It can shrink like a small glass, make difficulties overwhelming, or expand like a lake, helping us to reconcile and overcome. So why do we often choose to make glasses instead of lakes? There are many reasons. The first is the tendency to focus excessively on pain, causing it to fill the entire perception. Second, we often build the tragic narrative around the painful event, creating a spiral of injustice in our minds. Third, the comparative mind allows us to measure pain based on an imaginary standard of life that must be this or that. But in fact, the lake's perspective does not alleviate pain or create artificial peace, but rather a way to identify the inevitable challenges without adding unnecessary suffering. From this expansion of awareness, we can react more creatively to any situation without being overwhelmed or inhibited. Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." From the perspective of a lake, we know that everything arises and disappears in the vast space of awareness. Today's crisis will become a memory of tomorrow. We become lakes through the practice of expanding our natural awareness, resting in the presence of a wide audience. Gratitude helps us see the experiences of overcoming the difficulties in front of us, while service reminds us that our pain is a common part of the human experience. Tonight, as you reflect on the challenges you face, can you notice the difference in experiencing them from the perspective of a small glass or a vast lake? What would it feel like if you allowed your awareness to expand beyond the intensity of immediate difficulty, to encompass the broader context of the present moment? As the Buddha taught, if you want to know your mind, sit down and observe it. If the mind is clear, happiness will come. The clarity he spoke of was not without salt, but the openness to hold it skillfully. When we become a lake instead of a glass, we discover that pain is not an enemy, but can become a door to deeper compassion and freedom in life. Let us now discover together a powerful story of faith and destiny, one that exemplifies how faith itself can shape the path we walk. It's the story of a Japanese general who is faced with a seemingly insurmountable situation. His army was facing a much more powerful force. The enemy was numerically superior and took advantage of the terrain, making conventional military strategy seem helpless. The coming battle is inevitable to be a heavy defeat, and most people believe so. But deep down in the general's heart, there was a strong belief that victory was not something too far-fetched. Perhaps it was intuition, or perhaps it was a resilient, burning hope. But he felt sure that his cause was justified, and that even if the troops were outnumbered, the fighting spirit of his army would be able to overcome all difficulties. The only problem was that his soldiers, who, though they could count the numbers, could see the huge army waiting ahead, were gradually being invaded by panic and fear. Fear spreads in their ranks as an incurable disease. Their faces were covered with deep suspicion, and pessimistic whispered conversations spread throughout the camp, making it clear to the general that the soldiers' morale was crumbling before the battle began. He knew that an army once convinced that it would fail, no matter what skill, weaponry, or advantage it had, could change the outcome. But on the contrary, an army that believes in its victory can overcome the seemingly impossible by the power of that belief alone. On the morning of the big day, as they marched toward their fate, the general led the army to a small roadside temple where generations of warriors had stopped to pray before facing great trials. He gathered his soldiers around him, and together they prayed fervently, asking the gods for blessings and protection in the coming battle. When the prayer ended, the general pulled out a simple coin from his pocket, holding it high so that all could see it. He said in a voice full of determination, "My brethren, we have prayed and will now let our fate be determined by heaven. I will toss this coin into the sky. If it falls on the head side, we will win. If it's the tail, we're going to fail. Let's see what fate the gods have chosen for us." The soldiers drew closer, breathing shallow and rushing with suspense. It all seemed to depend on that moment, a coin toss in the morning air. The general tossed the coin aloft, all eyes watching as it flew up and then hung briefly in the sky before falling to the ground. The coin lies dormant in the dust, and that's the head. A cheer rang out from the ranks of the soldiers that could be heard from far away. Soldiers who were once full of fear and insecurity now embrace each other in renewed joy and confidence. The gods spoke up. Winning is a certainty. Filled with that divine strength and faith, the soldiers plunged into the fight with such great determination and coordination that they made the miracle happen. They won, despite the difference in numbers and terrain conditions, and their achievements were passed down through generations. As the battle was over and the general walked among the celebrating soldiers, the lieutenant beside him approached with astonished eyes. "General," the lieutenant said, "it's unbelievable. The coin revealed our fate exactly as he said. Surely no human power can change what heaven has arranged." The general smiled and replied, "You're right." He pulled the coin out of his pocket and handed it to the lieutenant for a thorough examination. Both sides are heads. The general used the story to emphasize a profound truth that the Buddha once taught. Everything we have is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become. Fate is not something that happens to us by chance, but rather the result of the beliefs and expectations we plant in our own souls. So why is it so easy to believe that fate is out of control, when in fact our minds play a central role in shaping our lives? Zen Buddhism teaches that although we cannot control all external factors, our strength lies in how we adjust our inner conditions to react to any circumstances that arise. This general understands human psychology and the nature of reality. He knew that the soldier's faith in victory was more important than any disadvantage in numbers or equipment. He realized that confidence, determination, and fighting spirit can transcend numbers when they are truly present in the soul. However, here's an even more profound lesson. The general doesn't simply deceive his soldiers with a game of chance. He created the conditions for their courage and natural strength to be revealed. Soldiers have possessed excellent combat abilities all this time. They just need to believe in themselves and their cause to turn their abilities into real strength. Their beliefs are not a naive lie, but a source of strength that helps them overcome their doubts and fears. Look back at your relationship with your destiny and your abilities. Do you often think that the outcome is predetermined, that success or failure is not within your reach? The general's double-sided coin is a symbol of the strength that each of us has to lean towards positive outcomes through the quality of engagement and faith we have in life. This doesn't mean that we can control things by thinking positively or believing that something will happen automatically. The soldiers still have to fight, still have to show their true skills and courage. But the belief in victory has created the necessary psychological conditions, helping their best qualities to be revealed and maximized. In the practice of Zen, we learn to work skillfully with effort and surrender, with intention and acceptance. We understand that even though we can't dictate a specific outcome, we can still profoundly influence the energy and attention we give to any given situation. This quality of interaction often determines whether we will experience success or failure, regardless of external circumstances. Zen master Hangpo once taught, "Foolish people reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." The general was wise enough to realize that the soldiers' thoughts about the battle influenced more than the thoughts of the numerical disadvantage. He works with psychological reality, does not fight against it. This is also an invitation to look deeply into the challenges and opportunities in your own life. You may be pessimistic, assuming failure before you fully start, focusing on obstacles instead of possibilities, and letting fear dictate how much effort you put in. So where do you need to create your own double-sided coin? A practice or perspective always prompts you to participate actively, regardless of the circumstances. The Buddha taught, "We are what we think. Everything we are arises from our thoughts. With our thoughts, we create the world." This is not a mystical miracle, but an acknowledgement of the creative power of consciousness. When we approach situations with real confidence, clarity, and commitment, we often discover hidden possibilities that we never realized we had. And from there, we know that it is our beliefs and attitudes that determine not only the outcome, but also the journey we take on this life's path. Tonight, as you sit back and think about the battles that are going on in your life, the challenges you are facing, and the outcomes you hope to achieve, can you find a version of yourself in that general's wise story? Can you create in your soul the inner conditions that help you reach your full potential instead of letting your deep fears dominate? Do you realize that while you can't completely control your fate, you can profoundly influence your beliefs and attitudes, which determine how fate unfolds with every step you take? The Buddha's wisdom once reminded us that thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle without diminishing the lifespan of the first candle. Happiness, too, never diminishes when shared. It was the general's confidence that ignited the fire of faith in the heart of each soldier, spreading strength to every soul. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is not to fight on our own, but to create favorable conditions for others and ourselves to discover the power that has been inherent in ourselves for a long time. Now, let me move on to another story, a story about the relationship between external circumstances and inner cultivation, the story of the horse and the mind in a remote mountainous region where reminders of death are constantly echoing awakenings. Bankai, a monk who once sought to challenge his own spiritual realization, spent many nights meditating under the shade of a wooden cross, using the proximity of death as a launching pad to penetrate deeper into the nature of reality. After a harsh retreat, he decided to find a peaceful place to rest, and he went to the area near a horse stable located on the embankment. Bankai lies down under the open sky, enjoying the deep tranquility of the high mountains. But the peace did not last long. The noise and chaos suddenly rang out from the nearby stables, the sharp whips and angry screams of a man, the cry of a beaten horse echoing and shaking the still. The Zen master observed the scene with increasing anxiety. That warrior seemed to be pouring out all the frustration and turmoil in his soul on the innocent horse. Each whip does not make the horse obedient, but it panics it even more, creating a vicious cycle of violence and resistance that never ends. Unable to take it any longer, he called out from his bed, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" But the warrior was still in a rage, ignoring the voice and continuing to beat the horse. The increasing cruelty makes Bankai even more worried about both people and things. With the authoritative voice of someone who had undergone years of spiritual training, he called again, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" This time, Bankai's voice pierced the cloud of anger that covered the warrior's mind. The man stopped his hand, stepped off his horse, and approached the embankment, his face shifting, a mixture of anger and curiosity. There was something in this stranger that made him stop, a calm and deep quality radiating from Bankai, demanding respect. "You're scolding me," the warrior said, his voice still a little angry but mixed with inquiry. "What do you want to say to me?" Bankai looks at him with compassionate eyes, not seeing him as an enemy, but as a human being trapped in the cycle of frustration that many of us have experienced. His answer was brief but profound. "Instead of beating the horse for unruly, why don't you punish and train your own mind?" Those words are like a bridge between two completely different approaches to facing difficulties. Warriors use external forces and control to impose willpower, while Bankai points out the path of inner self-mastery. As the Buddha once taught, conquer anger with no anger, triumph over evil with good, conquer evil with generosity, and conquer dishonesty with truth. These teachings are the essence of Bankai's lesson to the warrior. The struggles we are going through reflect our own inner state. We cannot force the world to conform to our expectations with aggression or control. The warrior's way of beating the horse to subdue is a metaphor for how we often deal with life's challenges. When we are frustrated by external conditions, we often react with anger, criticism, or manipulation, without realizing that the real cause lies deep within us. Buddhist psychology explains that the untrained mind tends to maintain its comfort by controlling the external environment, rather than developing flexibility and ingenuity to adapt to any circumstance. This creates a phenomenon known as pushing the river, i.e., exhausting oneself from trying to force reality to suit one's preferences. Let's look at everyday life. When a computer crashes on an important project, we get angry at the technology without realizing that clinging to its perfection is the problem. When we're stuck in traffic, we get angry at traffic without realizing that we expect travel to be smooth at all times. When a loved one doesn't listen to advice, we get frustrated because we can't control other people's choices. In all these situations, we are like horse warriors, using force and control to deal with external circumstances, while ignoring the very internal conditions that create pain and suffering. The horse here symbolizes the uncontrollable aspects of life, other people's behavior, natural events, technological glitches, and inherently unpredictable existence. Zen master Pema Chodron once said, "You are the sky. Everything else is just the weather." This quote underscores a similar truth that Bankai imparted to the warrior. Instead of trying to control the weather outside, we can learn to expand our awareness and remain calm despite the circumstances. True training is learning to work with our minds, not forcing the world to submit to our will. This doesn't mean being passive or accepting all the bad, but rather approaching challenges with a more stable inner self, rather than reacting with frustration and stress. Buddhism provides us with specific techniques for this inner training. Mindfulness meditation helps us observe our own reactions without letting them slip away, while practicing compassion develops love and forgiveness for ourselves and others when things don't go our way. Besides, contemplation of impermanence helps us to accept the ever-changing nature of all conditions. Through this, we realize that what is external is not the final barrier, but how we master our inner self that determines our lives. So tonight, in the face of challenges and fears, can you learn how to create a flame of faith within yourself, as the general did for his soldiers? Can you choose not to be a warrior who fights horses with a whip and anger, but someone who understands, is patient, and actively trains his mind to conquer any situation? Because in the end, we are not victims of fate, but the creators of it, by lighting the candle of faith, holding the inner sky, even though the rain and storm out there can still come at any time. Tonight, as you face the inevitable disappointments of everyday life, can you remember the profound teachings of Zen Master Bankai? When you feel like venting your anger and beating the horse, symbolizing the difficult circumstances that are holding you back, you can stop for a minute and ask yourself, what does it mean to train my own mind instead? The Buddha's wisdom taught that hatred can never be appeased by hatred, that only non-hatred can quench it. This is an eternal law of life, an undeniable truth. The path to true peace lies not in conquering or changing external conditions, but in cultivating inner qualities that are sustainable, stable, in spite of all the challenges that the outside world presents to us. The next story I want to tell you will help shed light on the power of returning to reality right in front of us when fear threatens to flood our minds and push us into despair. It is the story of a warrior who was captured during the ancient Japanese period, when clans were constantly at war, fighting for power. In a fierce battle, a skilled warrior suffered defeat. As his comrades fall one after another around him, and defeat becomes inevitable, he is captured by enemy soldiers and pulled off the battlefield. His armor was stripped off, his weapons confiscated, and that night, he was thrown into a dark, cramped cell with dense stone walls, as if weighing heavily on his mind and body. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and the echo in the space made his bones freeze. In the gloomy darkness of the prison, the warrior's mind begins to race with the scariest thoughts. He thought of tomorrow, the day he knew would come, because that was the law of war. First, an interrogation to obtain information about his lord's defenses, troops, and plans. When he resolutely remained silent, as honor demanded, they would use torture, forms of cruelty that he had heard other fighters recount with horror, but did not dare to speak out loud. Hot iron burns red, sharp pieces of bamboo under the nails, and other forms of torture aimed at breaking the will. And finally, when there is nothing left to exploit, or they are tired of his silence, there will be an inevitable execution. These thoughts were like a nightmare that never stopped wrapping around him. His heart beating so fast that he feared it might burst in his chest. His breathing became shallow and hurried. Sweat was dripping on his forehead, although the night air was still cool. Sleep seemed impossible to him, as his mind drew up painful and terrifying tomorrow scenarios, repeating themselves in his head like an inexorable nightmare. He walked about in his narrow cell, leaning against the cold stone wall, lying down on the rough straw floor. Nothing could bring comfort to the thoughts that were waiting to destroy his spirit. Then, in the depths of despair, he suddenly remembered the gentle voice of the Zen master who had taught him when he was in the monastery before he became a warrior. Those words echoed in his mind as clearly as if the teacher was sitting next to him in his cell. Tomorrow isn't real, the teacher said. Tomorrow is just an illusion. The warrior at first resists this teaching with fear. How can tomorrow be an illusion when every threat is so concrete, so certain? But as he gradually became quiet, sat still, and allowed the doctrine to permeate deeply, a change began to occur. He noticed his breath, a normal, natural, and comfortable breath. He could feel the straw underneath him, rough but not uncomfortable. He hears the wind whispering through the trees outside the window, a sound of the natural world that continues to operate in ancient rhythms despite human conflicts. In that moment, he was not tortured. He was not afraid of death. He was simply a man sitting in his cell, alive and awake. The horrors that once overwhelmed him were now just thoughts of a future that didn't exist, existed only in his imagination. As this understanding deepens, a peace gradually spreads in the warrior's soul. His breathing slowed down and deepened. The fast-paced heart now finds a steady and gentle rhythm. For the first time since his arrest, he smiled. The wisdom of the Zen master had freed him from a prison that held him even more than the stone walls around him, a prison of worries and fears of tomorrow. Within minutes, the warrior falls into peaceful sleep, a sleep of letting go and serenity. The Buddha once said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present state. If you want to know your future, look at your current actions." This ancient word of wisdom sheds light on the profound truth that the warrior discovered in his cell. The only moment in which we truly live is the present moment. Why do we torture ourselves with endless future scenarios? Zen Buddhism explains that the human mind evolves as a survival mechanism, always scanning for threats and planning defenses. While this ability helps us survive in critical situations, it becomes a source of distress when we confuse our fantasies with reality. Take a deep look at yourself. How many times does your anxiety stem from vivid fantasies about future situations that may never have happened? The presentation you're preparing, the results of a medical test you're waiting for, or the difficult conversation you're about to face. These are all scenarios that exist primarily in your mind, not in reality. The warrior's teachings show us that it is perfectly possible to accept future challenges without letting them consume our minds. Planning and preparation are necessary, but when it turns into anxiety and obsession, we lose our peace and clarity. As the Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once taught, thanks to impermanence, anything is possible. The future has not yet been written. It is shaped by causes and conditions that we cannot predict or control completely. The anxious mind often assumes that current difficulties will inevitably last or get worse, but impermanence teaches us that things are always changing. The warrior in the cell could not know what tomorrow would bring. It is possible that the Lord's forces will carry out rescue. Maybe other detainees will have mercy. Maybe diplomatic negotiations will lead to freedom. The Buddha once said, "The past is past, the future has not come, only the present moment is yours." This teaching does not encourage us to shirk our responsibilities or to prepare for the future, but it invites us to recognize where our attention usually goes, to gently bring it back to the richness of our present experience. In the practice of meditation, we cultivate a beginner's mind, embracing each moment with freshness rather than with anxiety and prejudice. When we live fully in the present, we often discover the source of strength and peace that anxious thoughts never bring. Consider the change in the way the warrior focuses on the present moment that completely changes his experience. The same cell, the same uncertain future, but by returning to reality, suffering transforms into peace. This transformation is always present in every moment of our anxiety or fear. So tonight, when you find your mind weaving fear stories about tomorrow, remember the captured warrior and the wisdom of the Zen master. Ask yourself, what's really happening right now? Simple experiences such as breathing, sitting still, feeling the temperature of the air are the anchor that brings you back to reality, not vague fantasies in your head. As the Buddha taught, don't live in the past, don't dream about the future, but focus your mind on the present moment. In that doctrine is hidden the key that opens the door of the warrior's prison and our own prison. And only then will we be truly free. Now together we will explore a profound story of fearlessness and the immense power that arises from accepting the unchangeable. The story tells the story of a meaningful encounter between a powerful general and an unshakable Zen master during the bloody civil war that tore apart feudal Japan, when wars constantly swept through the countryside like a terrible natural disaster that never stopped. Destruction and plunder, imposing power by force and fear. Every time news spread that a warlord's army was approaching, most of the people panicked, hurriedly packed up everything they could carry, leaving behind their beloved homes to flee to the mountains or find safety in remote towns. Try to escape the grim fate that awaits. In a small village, as the footsteps of enemy soldiers approached, the familiar scene reappeared. Families hurriedly packed their belongings, shops closed their doors, and the bustling streets suddenly became surprisingly quiet in a matter of hours. Everyone had fled, except for one person, an old Zen master who lived simply in a small temple in the center of the village. When the conquerors entered the village and found everything empty, they were confused by the smoke still rising from the chimney of the small temple. The existence of the smoke as a strange sign, a silent challenge to the devastation that has taken place. The general, who was only accustomed to seeing fear and submission everywhere he went, was curious about the man who dared to stay when they all fled. With some lieutenants, he decided to go to the place to investigate and confront this person. The general had hoped to see a frail old man who was unable to flee or had been left behind. But what he found was quite different. In front of the general's eyes was the image of an old Zen master sitting peacefully in a small garden, tending to the bushes and flowers with uncanny meticulousness and composure, as if there was no presence of an army besieging there, no war or danger imminent. The general was accustomed to being prostrated by the people of the villages, begging for forgiveness and protection from him, and accustomed to the scene of the people cowering, frightened, and fleeing when he and his soldiers entered. However, the indifference and incomprehensible calmness of the Zen master made him feel angry and confused, unable to accept that someone would dare to challenge his authority in such a casual way. "Fool!" the general shouted, echoing throughout the empty temple courtyard as he raised his sword, the gleam of his armor in the evening light, increasing his majesty and menacingness. Do you realize that you're in front of a man who can stab you without blinking? The threat that has made many people tremble cannot move you. However, the Zen master did not flinch. He still took care of a small flower bush with steady hands and a strangely serene expression. When he looked up at the general, His eyes were as calm as if he were greeting a familiar visitor, showing no signs of fear or defiance. He said in a calm and firm voice, "And did you notice that you're standing in front of a man who can be stabbed through without blinking?" The general stood still, half of the sword drawn in his hand, and the anger in his heart suddenly gave way to astonishment. In all his years of war and conquest, he witnessed all sorts of courage: the brave desperation of the cornered soldiers, the defiant fury of the enemy on the verge of defeat, and the reckless audacity of the young warriors. But never before had he encountered anything like this: absolute acceptance, fearlessness, deep peace before the approaching death. The Zen master's answer revealed something that the general had never thought of. There was a power greater than the ability to kill, and that was the fearlessness of death. This was a man who had so completely accepted the transitory nature of life that not even the immediate threat of death shook him. Slowly, the general pulled the sword back into its sheath, without saying a word. He turned away, leaving the Zen master in the peace of the little garden, and the village remained intact, without a scar of war, not devastated by any military strategy or negotiation, but by the sheer bravery of a single man. As the Buddha taught, all things that are conditioned are impermanent. Here, we discover the profound power that is born when we fully accept this basic truth, rather than trying all our lives to avoid it. Why does the complete acceptance of a temporary life create such a presence and authority? Zen Buddhism teaches that much of our fear does not come from external threats, but from a desperate clinging to what is inherently temporary. When that clinging dissipates, the threats themselves lose their ability to stir up our inner peace. The general's strength comes from the fear of death and loss of others, and the one who has fully accepted the impermanence of life cannot be intimidated by the things he is ready to give up. The master's fearlessness was not the result of blind courage or insensitivity, but a natural consequence of understanding so thoroughly and impermanently that even death could not surprise or frighten him. Try looking back at your relationship with the dangers and challenges of everyday life. How much of your fears stem from your clinging to maintaining the status quo, protecting your reputation, or maintaining physical comfort? The Zen master's answer implies that true inviolability does not come from being untouched, but from having nothing left to lose. This does not mean that we must be passive or welcome to hurt. He did not seek death, nor did he encourage violence, but his complete acceptance of death was what freed him from the paralyzing fear that most people drowned in the face of real danger. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 empty words is a word that brings peace." The Zen master's unique response contains greater power than any threat because it comes from a place of complete acceptance, not from opposition or fear. Tonight, as you face the pressures and threats of life, remember the deep reaction of the Zen master when facing the general's sword. You can find a space where acceptance of impermanence does not lead to resignation, but rather a form of presence that cannot be shaken and cannot be threatened. The Buddha's wisdom reminds us that the whole secret of existence is fearlessness. True freedom does not come from avoiding danger, but from understanding so deep that in the end, we cannot be vulnerable, rendering any external threat powerless to the essential peace within us. Now, let's enter together into a profound story, a lesson in the paradoxical nature of spiritual perception and the limits of conventional conceptual understanding. This is the story of the three attacks, along with the deeper insight it offers, taught in the mountain monastery, where the sixth patriarch of Zen Buddhism, Hui Nung, taught and led disciples from all over China in search of enlightenment. Among those who came to the monastery was an outstanding young monk named Shen Hui, known for his keen intellect and unrelenting curiosity, often asking profound questions and challenging the master with complex philosophical ideas, unlike the majority of disciples who only seek basic guidance. One afternoon, full of golden sunlight pouring through the monastery window, as the air was filled with the peaceful sounds of monks practicing meditation, Shen Hui found the sixth patriarch sitting quietly in the main hall, with a calm posture, gentle and natural breathing, serene but still alert expression, the vivid embodiment of meditation in action. Seeing an opportunity to test his understanding against the master's enlightenment, Shen Hui decided to approach a question that had been brewing in his mind throughout his meditation practice. A question related to the cognitive nature of spiritual practice, which was a source of great curiosity and confusion for him. "Hello, Master," Shen Hui said, bowing respectfully, but his voice was filled with the confidence of someone who believes his question was particularly profound. "When you sit in meditation, do you see it?" For Shen Hui, this is a perfectly logical investigation into the cognitive mechanisms of enlightenment. Do you want to know if awakened consciousness is related to a particular kind of gaze? Does meditation reveal mystical visions or a higher awareness that the normal mind cannot have? Or is awareness truly beyond all ordinary sights, existing in a pure state beyond sensory experience? But what he received was completely unexpected and unpredictable. Without explanation, the sixth patriarch took his wooden stick and hit Shen Hui 3 times in a row, not gently, but with powerful blows, leaving the young monk in both physical pain and mental confusion. "When I hit you," the patriarch asked, his voice calm, as if he was just talking about the weather, "are you hurting?" Shen Hui rubbed his hot shoulders, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. The question was simple, but in that context, he felt that a straightforward answer might not be enough. Physical sensations are undeniable, but the spiritual implications are much more complex. "It's both harmful and not harmful," he replied carefully, his intuition telling him that the teacher was pointing out a paradox that went far beyond ordinary logic. "I saw it and I didn't see it," the patriarch replied, his voice carrying the weight of direct experience rather than philosophical speculation. But Shen Hui's intellect was not satisfied with this paradox, insisting on understanding the mechanism by which he could classify and interpret the doctrine in terms that his conceptual mind could grasp. "How can you see and not see at the same time?" he emphasized, his voice clearly confused. "That seems contradictory. Either you see it while meditating, or you don't see it. How can you be both right at the same time?" The patriarch's answer came with the patience of someone who has spent decades helping students overcome the limits of dualistic thinking. "What I see," he explains gently, "are fluctuations and wanderings in my mind. What we don't see is right and wrong, good and bad of others. That is what I see and what I don't see." With these words, the whole doctrine seemed to be crystallized in a moment of clarity. The master does not speak of mystical visions or transcendent states, but of a radical change in perception, a true spiritual maturity. The ancient Buddhist wisdom said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you will become." This teaching is deeply related to the patriarch's lesson on the nature of enlightenment. Why are we confused when spiritual teachings transcend conventional logic? Zen Buddhism explains that our conceptual mind operates through dualistic categories: seeing or not seeing, pain or non-pain, right or wrong. But enlightened awareness does not eliminate these experiences. Rather, it transforms our relationship with them. The deeper lesson here shows that true spiritual awareness actually involves understanding the mental processes within oneself. The patriarch clearly sees the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and reactions in his mind. This is not some mystical power, but a natural result of sustained mindfulness practice. He observed the fluctuations and uncertainties of consciousness without getting lost in them, and at the same time did not impose judgments of right and wrong, good and bad, on the behavior of others. The unseen, he says, is not ignorance, but wisdom, recognizing that such judgments often reflect more on the observer and not the one being observed. Try looking deeply into your own cognitive patterns. What percentage of what you think you see in others are actually your mental projections? When someone annoys you, are you seeing their actual behavior or just your own agent and reaction? When someone impresses you, do you recognize their true qualities, or is it just the desire for approval and accomplishment in you that is reflecting on them? This ancient wisdom sheds light on the difference between reactive perception and insight. Perception reacts based on our past conditions, emotional needs, and judgmental habits. Insight, on the other hand, involves being aware of one's own mental processes while remaining open and receptive to what is truly present. Zen Master Dogen taught, "The study of Buddha is the study of oneself. To study yourself is to forget yourself." This teaching points to the same insight that the patriarch imparted. Really looking is not focusing on external judgments and judgments, but rather shifting attention to one's own mental processes. The 3 attacks Shenhui received were not punishment, but skillful teaching. Physical pain, both hurtful and harmless, is intended to reveal the mystery of conscious experience itself. Suffering arises in awareness, which is fully felt, but is not defined or limited by the awareness that has experienced it. Likewise, thoughts and emotions appear in consciousness without contaminating its essential clarity. Try to reflect on how this teaching can transform your everyday experience. Instead of constantly judging other people's behavior, finding fault, comparing, and giving opinions, what if you turned your attention to observing your own mental reactions? What patterns will you discover in the wanderings and fluctuations of the mind? This does not mean passivity or loss of distinction. On the contrary, you will develop the ability to react from clarity rather than blind reaction. When you see your judgmental tendencies clearly, you will naturally become less caught up in them. When you observe your mental projections, you are less likely to confuse them with objective reality. In the practice of Zen, we cultivate the so-called mirror mind, the perception that reflects everything that arises without being tainted or altered by it. This mirror sees things clearly while retaining the essential emptiness and openness. Tonight, as you find your mind categorizing and judging the experiences of the day, remember the patriarch's teachings. Can you turn your attention inward to the seer within yourself, instead of constantly judging what is seen? Can you find freedom from seeing your own mental processes clearly without being enslaved by them? The Buddha once said, "You yourself, as well as anyone in the entire universe, deserve love and compassion. By learning to view our own mental patterns with compassion instead of judgment, we develop the clarity to see others with equal kindness and understanding. It is from this deep realization that enlightenment ceases to be a distant goal, but becomes a way of life, an insightful insight that is not bound by the limitations of language or conceptual thinking, where our minds are the natural and peaceful reflection of everything that is happening in every moment of our lives live. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let's discover together a story of contentment and the nature of desire, that of the stonecutter's journey. In the high mountains, in idyllic small villages, there is a simple stone carver who stumbles upon the secret of happiness without even realizing it. Every dawn, he used to climb the winding roads that led to the quarries, carrying his carving tools on his shoulders. As he worked among the massive rocks, he sang ancient mountain songs, melodies echoing through the quiet valleys. Despite being poor by society's standards, living in a modest hut with very few possessions, the stonecutter wanted nothing more than what he had. His simple life is full of wholeness. The steady rhythm of work, the surrounding beauty of the mountains and forests, and the satisfaction of true labor filled his heart with a peace unaffected by the noise of the outside world. Then one day, he was invited to work in a magnificent mansion of a wealthy aristocrat. As he approached the estate, the stonecutter's eyes widened because he was overwhelmed by the magnificent magnificence that appeared in front of him. The soaring marble columns touching the blue sky, the vast gardens manicured in perfect symmetry amazed him. For the first time in his life, the stonecutter felt a sharp pain of desire that pierced his inherent contentment. If only I had been rich, he sighed, then I wouldn't have to make a living by sweat and toil like I do now. But to his surprise, a voice whispered from the surrounding rocks, "My wish has been granted. From now on, whatever you desire will be given." That night, he returned home to find his humble hut gone, replaced by a magnificent mansion, no different from the nobleman he had seen earlier. Filled with joy, the stonecutter abandoned the tools of labor and began to enjoy the luxurious life of the wealthy. But one sweltering afternoon, as he looked out of his ornately decorated window, he saw the royal procession passing by. The king sat in the cool shade, surrounded by servants and nobles, seemingly serene and strong, despite the scorching heat. "I wish I were king," he thought, and immediately found himself lounging on the silk cushions in the royal carriage, feeling the luxury. But the carriage was hotter than he expected, and the sunlight penetrated through the thick wall around it, making him uncomfortable. He immediately longed for another, greater power. "I want to be the sun," he declared, and suddenly he was scattering waves of light and heat throughout the universe. As the sun, he felt magnificent and powerful until the black storm clouds came to completely obscure his light. He wants to be a cloud again. And so he turned into a large storm cloud, proud of his ability to obscure the sun. But when it became rain, he encountered a huge rock blocking his way. "A mere rock is stronger than me," he thought. "I want to be a rock." Immediately, he stood tall on the mountainside, feeling his true eternity. However, the crackling sound of chipping sounded at the foot of the mountain. He looked down and saw a tiny figure cutting pieces of stone from his base. "A little creature is stronger than me," he realized. "I want to be a man again." And so he returned to the form of a stonecutter, climbing familiar mountain roads. But now something has changed inside him. As he shaped the stones and felt the mountain winds, his heart was filled with a deep sense of contentment. His songs sound richer and more emotional than before, because he has learned to be satisfied with who he is. The Buddha once said, "Health is the greatest gift. Contentment is the greatest wealth." This ancient wisdom illuminates the endless cycle of desire, the cycle that often leaves us unaware of the abundance inherent in our own lives. Why do we keep chasing different conditions, always believing that happiness lies in the next transition? Each wish that is fulfilled only reveals the next one, creating an endless cycle of discontent. The stonecutter's journey shows the futility of seeking happiness through external circumstances. Try looking back at your personal versions of yourself in this cycle. "I'll be happy to get promoted," you say, only to realize the new tensions come again. "I'll be happy with more money," you think, but then wealth brings new worries. Every achievement you achieve is just a new mountain to conquer. Zen master Suzuki Roshi once said, "Each of you is perfect in your own way, and maybe you just need a little improvement." This paradox highlights the centrality of contentment, the ability to fully accept what is, while wholeheartedly participating in life's natural changes. The ultimate transformation of the stonecutter is not to become someone greater, but to appreciate what he is. His work hasn't changed, but his relationship with life has been completely different. Contentment does not come from having different experiences, but from bringing a different perception to any experience that arises. Tonight, when you realize the habit of the mind, always reaching for what is not present, test the ultimate wisdom of the stonecutter. Can you find the song in your soul when you stop trying to be anything other than yourself? As the Buddha taught, contentment is natural wealth. Luxury is artificial poverty. The biggest transformation is not to become something different, but to realize the completeness inherent in what we already have. As we continue our journey through Zen wisdom, the story of the stonecutter reminds us of the profound simplicity of true happiness, that it is not what we seek outside, but the spiritual state we choose to live in each present moment, complete and satisfying. This is a vital lesson about letting go of endless desires and discovering wholeness within oneself. Let's move on to a tale of the profound difference between resistance and flow, an inspirational teaching from an old man, and a waterfall in a remote mountain village where a river rushes through ancient rocks. There was an old sage who used to walk along the water's edge, stepping gently on the wet rocks, his eyes intently observing the rhythmic interaction between the endless flow of water and the solid rocks trying to divert the river, as if to resist the untiring perseverance of nature. The villagers respected him not only for his age, but also for his gentleness, depth, and stillness, because he seemed to hold a secret understanding of the natural world that others had never known. A knowledge forged from years of contemplation and subtle observation of every movement of nature around him. One afternoon, when the storm clouds gathered in the sky, the rain began to fall in torrents, and the river that had flowed gently suddenly rose violently with unusual strength. The current became ferocious and unpredictable, rushing towards a soaring waterfall, falling into a rocky canyon below. During these extreme weather conditions, most people stay away from the area, knowing that anyone who accidentally falls into the rapids will face almost certain death, because of the jagged and dangerous rocks that await at the foot of the falls. However, the wise old man, while walking along a familiar road along the river, was suddenly swept away by a storm. As he tried to return to safety, the soft mud bank beneath his feet suddenly collapsed, causing him to lose his balance and fall into the fast-flowing water. Before he could react, he was swept away by the strong current, rushing towards the waterfall. The people in the village who witnessed the fall could not help but be horrified. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching him be swept away by the violent water that could not be stopped. Everyone was convinced that he would not be able to survive, especially with his old age and limited strength. The villagers were ready to search for his body when the river was calm enough to dive. But to their great surprise, as everyone hurried towards the foot of the falls, they saw the old man emerge from the water far below, perfectly safe. There are no scratches or injuries. He swam quietly to shore, the water from his clothes dripping on the rocks, and then sat down to rest with a calm expression, as if he had just enjoyed a refreshing swim on a sunny day. The villagers ran to him, unable to believe their eyes, and asked in amazement, "How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks were so dangerous, for all reasons he couldn't escape." The old man smiled kindly at everyone's worries and gently poured water from his sleeve onto the ground, staring at each person intently before answering. "I survived because I adapted to the water. Not the water had to adapt to me," he said. "When I felt myself falling, I didn't fight the water or try to force it to change course. Without thinking, I allow myself to be shaped by it. When the water wants to go down, I go down with it. When the water swirls, I swirl with it. When the water rolls up, I roll it along. I became like the water itself. And that's what saved my life." The villagers listened, fell silent, and began to understand that they had witnessed a profound principle, not just a lucky accident. This principle is the result of many years of study and meticulous observation by the old man about the nature of existence and the constant movement of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything changes. Existence is always changing and becoming. Here, we learn an important lesson about the wisdom of working with the natural flow of life, rather than exhausting ourselves in futile resistance to forces beyond our control. Why do we instinctively resist difficult circumstances when fluency and adaptability can help us overcome all challenges more gently and effectively? Zen Buddhism teaches that the ego in our minds always wants to control all external conditions by the power of will, but that very approach often increases suffering more than the initial difficulty. The old man's survival was not merely a matter of luck, but the result of a thorough understanding of the nature of existence and how to work in harmony with the currents of life. When we adjust ourselves to the natural flow of events, instead of demanding that our lives fit our preferences, we often discover hidden resources and creative possibilities that resistance makes us invisible. Ask yourself, how much energy do you devote to fighting against circumstances you can't change? You can try a different approach, not passive submission, but conscious adaptation, maintaining your essential nature and values while flowing with changing conditions. This doesn't mean you have to accept harmful circumstances or give up on your values and goals, but rather change your survival strategy more wisely. The old man did not give up his desire to survive, He simply knew when to cooperate with the power of water instead of against it. Instead of going against the current, he used it as a companion. Instead of resisting the direction of the flow, he moves with it while retaining deep awareness and intention. In life, in relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we are often faced with similar choices. We can drain our energy by trying to force an outcome, control the behavior of others, or make the situation match our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with existing reality, finding creative ways to achieve deeper goals through adaptation and flexibility rather than rigidity and coercion. The Zen master taught, water is liquid, soft, and yielding, but water can wear down the rock intolerably and be destroyed. The old man in the story is the living embodiment of that teaching, proving that seemingly powerless weakness is a great source of strength when applied with wisdom and awareness. The Buddha also said, hatred does not end with hatred, but can only end with love. This is the law of eternity. This principle goes beyond hatred to encompass all forms of resistance. Problems in life are rarely solved by fighting directly against them, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the fundamental forces involved. Take a deep look at the current stresses or conflicts in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction instead of learning how to swim with the current? What does it mean when you adapt to the situation while keeping your core values and intentions the same? Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable currents of everyday life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you recall the old man's wise teaching? Can you find a way to hold your center while flowing with forces you can't change? Can you discover that sometimes the most direct path to your goal is the path through obstacles instead of overcoming them? The Buddha's wisdom reminds us that in the end, only three things really matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, and how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with the flow of life is ultimately learning to let go of the need to control everything, while maintaining the ability to react wisely to everything that comes your way. Like water, we can be both strong and soft, tenacious and flexible, and strong and gentle. As our collective journey comes to an end, let's take a moment to pay attention to the quality of this present moment. Feel the stillness that remains when the stories end. A stillness is not created, but simply revealed. The profound stillness you can touch right now is not a treasure you have found, but a solid foundation of yourself, waiting patiently under the delicate sands of moving thoughts and emotions. The Buddha taught, just as a solid rock is not swayed by the wind, the wise are not swayed by praise or reproach. This is the silent truth that echoes through each of the profound Buddhist stories we have shared in our quest for peace tonight. The winds of life, the worries, the plans, and the constant streams of thoughts running around in the mind cannot be stopped. Stories are not to stop that wind, but to help us discover the unshakable rock of awareness within us. Each lesson is a step in the journey of finding an inner fulcrum, a deep stability that is not shaken by fleeting changes in life experience. Even now, if your mind blows up a new thought, you don't have to get carried away by it. The wisdom here is to understand that you are not the wind, but the rock. This awareness can now become a more familiar space to you, a peaceful refuge to which you can return at any time. As you settle deep into stillness, allow yourself to feel that unshakable quality, feel the solidity in your body and the space around your thoughts. This is the essence of true rest. Not trying to reach a certain state, but simply resting in the state that is already here, right now. In the silence after my words, just stay still with this solid sense of center, observing your naturally gentle breathing, allowing the mind to be still without reacting. These teachings are timeless reminders of the power hidden in unresponsiveness. They show that freedom is always available when we stop letting the outside world dominate our inner peace. As you pass from this quiet space back into your daily life, expect you to carry this unshakable sense of calm with you. Let it be a silent platform that supports you to stand firm and live authentically in every moment of your life. Thank you for accompanying us on this journey at the Monk Tells Bedtime Stories. Sleep well.